$12.30. That's what they think a man's whole life is worth. Ethan Walker heard the words hiss behind him the moment his hand went up in that silent auction hall, and he didn't turn around to see who said it. Everyone in that room already knew what he was bidding on a dead Harley Shop nobody wanted buried under debt and rumor. They laughed, they pointed, they filmed him on their phone. None of them knew that behind those locked doors waited a secret that was about to tear his entire past wide open. Before we go any further, if you're watching this from a city I've never mentioned before, drop it in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled tonight. And if stories about broken men, second chances, and the kind of loyalty that never dies means something to you, hit subscribe and stay with me all the way to the end, because this story is not what you think it is. The auction hall in that small Montana town had already sold off 6 properties that morning, a diner, 2 houses, a stretch of empty farmland, and every sale had drawn a crowd of serious bidders with folders and calculators and cold, practical eyes. Then the auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Roland Coleman, cleared his throat and shuffled his papers, and something in his posture changed. "Last item on the docket," Coleman said, not looking up. "Property at 4th and Miller, former motorcycle repair shop. Vacant 14 years. Sold as is, no inspection, no warranty, buyer assumes all liens and back taxes." He paused, glanced at the room, and added almost apologetically, "Opening bid $12.30. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. A woman near the front turned to her husband and said loud enough for half the room to hear, $12 for a haunted building nobody's touched in a decade. Bargain of the century." Her husband chuckled. "Only a fool would raise his hand for that." That was when Ethan Walker raised his hand. The laughter didn't stop. If anything, it got louder because everyone in that hall recognized him. Not by name, most of them didn't know his name, but by the old black leather vest he wore, faded at the shoulders, a ghost of patches long since removed, leaving pale outlines where stitching used to be. They recognized him as the man who fixed motorcycles out of a rented garage on the edge of town for whatever cash people could spare. The man who used to ride with a real club before something happened that nobody quite understood, and who now walked through town like a shadow of whatever he used to be. "You serious, Walker?" The man's voice called out from the back, a voice Ethan knew. He turned his head just slightly and saw Duke Ferris standing near the exit arms, crossed a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. Duke had ridden with Ethan once years ago before everything fell apart. Now Duke wore a clean leather cut with patches Ethan didn't recognize from a chapter Ethan had never been welcome in. "I'm serious," Ethan said quietly. "You don't have $12, man," Duke said, and a few people laughed again. "You don't have 12 cents. Everybody in this town knows you're 2 months behind on your garage rent." Ethan felt the heat rise up his neck, but he kept his eyes forward on Coleman, on the gavel resting in the auctioneer's hand. "I've got $12.30, he said. "That's exactly what's being asked." Coleman looked at him for a long moment, the way a man looks at someone he's not sure is joking. "Bids on the floor," he finally said. "$12.30 from the gentleman near the window." Do I hear 13 silence? Going once, boys. Someone near the back muttered something that made 3 or 4 people snort with laughter. Going twice. And then just as Coleman lifted the gavel, a new voice cut through the room. Smooth, unhurried, expensive. $50. Every head turned. A man in a gray tailored coat stood near the side doorphone. In one hand, the other tucked into his pocket like he had somewhere better to be. Ethan didn't recognize him, but he recognized the type immediately, the kind of man who didn't buy property, he acquired it. The kind of man whose presence made a room rearrange itself around him without anyone deciding to. "Mr. Harrington's representative," Coleman said, clearly startled. "Didn't expect you folks to have interest in this particular lot." "We have interest in a great deal of property on that side of town," the man in gray said pleasantly. $50. Ethan's stomach dropped. He had exactly $12.30 to his name, literally physically in his pocket, counted 3 times that morning at his kitchen table. He didn't have $50. He didn't have anything close to $50. $60, Ethan said anyway before he could stop himself. The room went quiet in a different way now. Not mocking silence, tense silence. The man in gray smiled slightly, like a man amused by a dog that had learned to bark on command. $100. Coleman looked at Ethan and, for just a second, something like pity crossed his face. Son, if you don't have the funds, I have the funds, Ethan said, though his voice cracked slightly on the word funds because he absolutely did not. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know why his mouth kept moving faster than his bank account could follow. All he knew was that something about the way that man in gray said, "Oh, we have interest in a great deal of property on that side of town," had lit something in his chest that hadn't burned in years, not since the day he'd turned in his colors and walked away from the only family he'd ever really had. 110, Ethan said. The man in gray's smile faded slightly. He glanced at his phone thumbs moving fast like he was texting someone for instructions. Whatever answer came back seemed to satisfy him because he pocketed the phone and said, almost bored, "We'll let this one go. Not worth the paperwork for a shop that's going to be rubble in 6 months anyway." He turned and walked out without looking at Ethan again. Coleman blinked, recalibrated, and raised his gavel. Bid stands at $110 from Mr. Walker. Going once, going twice. The gavel came down with a crack that seemed too loud for the room. Sold for $110. The room erupted not in celebration, but in disbelieving laughter whispers, phones lifting to capture the moment. Ethan stood frozen at the podium table, the reality of what he'd just done crashing over him in a cold wave. He had just bid $110 he did not have on a building that everyone in town agreed was worthless. "You want to explain to me," Coleman said quietly, waving off the crowd, leaning close so only Ethan could hear, "how you're going to pay $110 when you told me 2 minutes ago you only had 12. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket past the $12.30 and pulled out a folded 20, the last one he had hidden separately in case he needed cab fare home. He counted out what he had onto the table, the $12.30, the 20, and then, hands shaking slightly, he unclasped the old steel watch from his wrist, the one thing of value he still owned, and set it beside the cash. "That watch is worth more than the rest combined," he said. "Each has the difference. I'm good for it." Coleman looked at the watch, then at Ethan's face, and something shifted in his expression. Not pity this time, but a kind of grudging respect. "You don't even know what's inside that building," he said quietly. "No," Ethan admitted. "I don't. 14 years empty, could be full of asbestos, could be condemned by the county next month. You understand that?" "I understand," Ethan said. Coleman studied him a moment longer, then slid the watch back across the table. "Keep your watch. I'll take the cash and you can owe the county the rest through the courthouse office by Friday. That's how it's supposed to work anyway." He hesitated, then added almost to himself, "Man walks into a room and bids on something nobody else wants and then offers up the one thing he owns to make it right. Don't see that much anymore." As Ethan turned from the table, an elderly woman near the folding chairs reached out and touched his sleeve. He didn't recognize her, but there was something steady and unhurried in the way she looked at him, nothing like the eyes that had followed him through the room all morning. "My husband used to buy his parts from that shop," she said quietly, "before it closed. Man who ran it, Whitmore was his name, never took a dime more than what he was owed. Best mechanic this county ever had, and it emptied out overnight, and nobody ever really said why." She studied Ethan's face a moment, like she was searching for something in it. "You be careful in there, young man. Buildings like that don't stay quiet forever." Before Ethan could ask what she meant, she had already turned and shuffled toward the door, leaving him standing there with the deed in his hand and a new unfamiliar unease settling into his chest. Ethan didn't answer Coleman further. He picked up the deed papers off the table, folded them carefully, and walked toward the exit past Duke Ferris, who was still standing there with his arms crossed. "You always did have to prove something," Duke said not unkindly as Ethan passed him. "Wasn't proving anything," Ethan said. "Just didn't like the way that man talked." "That man works for Victor Harrington," Duke said, and something in his voice made Ethan stop walking. "You don't know that name?" "Should I?" Duke shook his head slowly, like Ethan had just picked a fight he didn't understand the size of. "Harrington's been buying up half of Miller Street for 2 years. Quiet, careful, one property at a time. Nobody knows why yet. But if his people showed interest in your little $12 shop, brother, that shop is worth a whole lot more than $12. "It's not your business anymore, Duke," Ethan said, and the words came out harder than he meant them to. "Hasn't been in a long time." Something flickered across Duke's face, old hurt, buried under years of silence. "No," he agreed quietly. "Guess it hasn't." He turned and walked away without another word, and Ethan stood there for a moment in the parking lot, the deed papers clutched in his hand, wondering why his chest suddenly felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with money. He drove home in his aging pickup truck, with the deed on the passenger seat, and the whole way he kept glancing at it like it might disappear if he looked away too long. $110, his last 20. Everything he had spent on a building that had been empty for 14 years, that everyone in town called cursed, that had somehow, for reasons he couldn't explain, made a stranger in an expensive coat text someone for permission before walking away. He didn't sleep that night. He lay on the thin mattress in the back room of his rented garage, listening to the wind rattle the loose tin siding, running numbers in his head that never came out right. Rent was due in 9 days. He owed his landlord, a tired, patient man named Frank Delgado, for the last 2 months already, and Frank had made it clear gently but firmly that patience wasn't infinite. "I like you, Ethan," Frank had told him 3 weeks earlier, standing in the doorway of the garage with his hands in his pockets. "You're good with the customers. You do honest work, but I got a mortgage too, and I can't keep carrying you forever." "I know, Frank. I'll figure it out. You always say that." "I mean it every time." Frank had looked at him for a long moment the way people looked at Ethan now, like they were trying to see the man he used to be underneath the man he'd become. "You used to have people behind you, Ethan, a whole club full of brothers who'd have burned this town down before they let you go under. What happened to that?" Ethan hadn't answered. He never answered that question because the answer was a wound that hadn't finished healing and probably never would. He remembered the night of the vote with a clarity he wished he didn't have. The clubhouse had been packed thick with cigarette smoke, and the particular kind of silence that came before something irreversible. The club president at the time, a broad-shouldered man named Gareth Voss, had stood in the center of the room with his arms crossed, waiting for Ethan to explain himself. "You put your hands on a brother," Gareth had said. "Doesn't matter what he did behind closed doors. That's not how this works, and you know it." "He was putting his hands on her," Ethan had answered, standing his ground even as the room turned colder around him. "Every night for over a year. You think I was supposed to just let that keep happening because he wears a patch? I think you had options that didn't end with him in the hospital and her disappearing before anyone could even ask her what happened. She didn't disappear. I made sure she got somewhere safe. You made a unilateral decision that put this whole club's name in a police report." Gareth had said, his voice flat and final. "That's not loyalty, Ethan. That's a man who thinks his own conscience matters more than his brother's." "Maybe it does," Ethan had said quietly, and that single sentence had ended everything. The vote had taken 4 minutes. He remembered every second of it, the raised hands, the ones who wouldn't meet his eyes, Duke standing near the back with his jaw tight and his hand never rising at all, though it hadn't mattered because the majority was enough. He'd ridden out of that clubhouse parking lot alone. That night, patches gone, name gone, everything gone except the certainty buried somewhere beneath the humiliation that he would make the same choice again. Lying in the dark that night after the auction, staring at the water stain on the ceiling, shaped vaguely like a bird in flight, Ethan thought about that question again. What happened to that? He thought about the brothers who used to ride beside him, who used to call him at 2 in the morning just to talk, who used to show up at his door with tools and food, and no questions asked whenever things got hard. He thought about the night it had all ended, the accusations, the vote, the long ride out of town with nothing but his bike and the vest on his back, stripped of every patch that mattered. He'd made a choice that night years ago. He'd chosen to protect someone who couldn't protect themselves, and it had cost him everything. He didn't regret the choice. He regretted sometimes in the loneliest hours that nobody had ever believed him about why he made it. His phone buzzed against the floor beside the mattress a few minutes past 6 in the morning, and Ethan almost let it ring itself out before he saw Frank Delgado's name on the screen. "You're up early," Ethan answered, throat rough with the sleep he never actually got. "Word travels fast in a small town, Ethan," Frank said, an edge in his voice Ethan hadn't heard before. "I hear you spent your rent money on some cursed shop over on Miller Street." "I didn't spend the rent money, Frank. I spent everything else." "That's supposed to make me feel better." Ethan closed his eyes. "I'll figure it out." "You keep saying that." A pause heavy with something that wasn't quite anger. "Look, I'm not trying to lean on you. I like you, you know that. But I've got a family counting on that rent. And if you're standing in some empty building instead of standing in my garage fixing bikes for money, I don't know how to help you. Give me until Friday, Ethan said. Just Friday. I'll have something for you by then. Frank was quiet for a long moment. Friday, he finally said, "That's the last one, Ethan. I mean it this time." The line went dead and Ethan lay there in the gray, early light, staring at that water-stained bird on the ceiling, feeling the walls of his life pressing in a little tighter than they had the night before. By morning, he told himself he was going to see the shop with clear eyes, sell whatever scrap metal was inside for enough to cover the debt and move on with his life. That was the plan. That was the sensible plan. The plan lasted exactly as long as it took him to unlock the front door. The key Coleman had given him was old heavy brass gone dark with age, and it fought him in the lock for almost a full minute before something inside finally gave with a groan. Ethan pushed the door open, bracing himself for the smell of mold and rot and 14 years of abandonment. Instead, the smell that hit him was motorcycle oil. Not old, stale, forgotten oil. Fresh-smelling leather and metal and something like cedar, the way a workshop smells when someone has been maintaining it, caring for it, keeping it alive. Ethan stood frozen in the doorway, one hand still on the brass key, staring into a room that made no sense. The shop was not destroyed, it was not decayed. It was preserved impossibly meticulously, preserved like a photograph of a moment frozen 14 years ago and somehow kept from aging a single day. Motorcycles stood in careful rows across the shop floor, covered in canvas tarps that had clearly been changed and cleaned regularly. Tools hung on a pegboard wall in an order so precise it looked like a diagram from a manual, each wrench and socket in its designated silhouette, not one out of place. A workbench along the far wall held a partially disassembled engine, its pieces laid out in the exact sequence a mechanic would need to reassemble it, as though the man working on it had simply stepped away for lunch and never come back, except that lunch had been 14 years ago. "What in the hell?" Ethan breathed, stepping inside slowly, his boots echoing on concrete that had clearly been swept recently. He walked the length of the shop floor in a kind of daze, running his hand along the canvas tarp of the nearest bike, half expecting his fingers to come away covered in dust. They didn't. The tarp was clean. Someone had been here. Someone had been keeping this place alive for years in secret, while the entire town believed it was a rotting, forgotten husk. He pulled the tarp back from the nearest bike and felt his breath catch. It was a Harley Panhead, a genuine vintage machine restored to a condition so flawless it looked like it had rolled off a showroom floor that morning, rather than sat under canvas for over a decade. The chrome caught what little light filtered through the grimy front windows and threw it back in sharp, clean lines. "This bike alone is worth more than this whole building," he murmured to himself, and then he laughed, a short, disbelieving sound that echoed strangely in the empty shop. "I paid $110. He moved deeper into the building, past the second and third bikes, each one as pristine as the first. Each one representing a different era of Harley history, like someone had been curating a private museum rather than running a repair shop. On the far wall above a row of dented filing cabinets hung a collection of photographs in mismatched frames, dozens of them spanning what looked like decades. Ethan stepped closer, squinting in the dim light. Every photograph showed the same weathered, kind-eyed man standing beside a different person entirely. A young man in an oil-stained jumpsuit grinning next to a finished engine. A teenage girl holding up a wrench like a trophy. An older woman standing proudly beside a restored Indian motorcycle with tears visible even in the faded print. Beneath each photograph, a small handwritten label listed a name and a single word. Marcus rebuilt, Diane rebuilt, Calvin rebuilt. Ethan stood in front of that wall for a long time, an uneasy feeling crawling up the back of his neck, though he couldn't yet explain why. It looked less like a shop's decoration and more like a shrine to something much bigger than motorcycle repair. He found a small office in the back corner, its door slightly ajar, and when he pushed it open, he found a desk, a chair, a wall of filing cabinets, and a calendar still hanging on the wall. The pages never turned past a date 14 years in the past. And on the desk, centered perfectly, sat a single envelope. Ethan's pulse quickened as he approached it. It was old, the paper yellowed slightly at the edges, but it had been placed there deliberately recently, not left to gather 14 years of dust like everything else that had actually been abandoned. Someone had put this here for him to find. Recently, maybe even that morning. He reached out and picked it up, and his hand went still, when he saw what was written across the front in careful, deliberate handwriting. Not to the new owner. Not whoever finds this, it read Ethan Walker, his full name. His actual name written in ink that had clearly aged along with the paper, meaning it had been written years ago, long before he had ever walked into that auction hall, long before he had any idea he would end up owning this building at all. That's not possible, Ethan said out loud to the empty office to no one. He turned the envelope over in his hands, twice checking the back for some explanation, some clue that this was a trick, a coincidence, a different Ethan Walker who had once meant to buy this shop and never had. But there was nothing on the back. Just his name on the front in ink that predated his ownership by more than a decade. His hands were not entirely steady as he tore it open. Inside was a letter, several pages written in the same careful handwriting as the envelope. Ethan sat down heavily in the office chair, which creaked under him after 14 years of disuse, and began to read. Dear Ethan, if you are reading this, then the plan finally worked, and I want you to know that I have thought about this letter for a very long time, trying to find the right words, and I don't think there are any right words for what I need to tell you. So I will simply tell you the truth and trust that a man like you can handle it. My name is Samuel Whitmore. You do not know that name, but I promise you, you know me. Ethan stopped reading for a moment, his eyes fixed on that line. He did not know a Samuel Whitmore. He was certain of that. He had never met anyone by that name in his entire life. And yet something about the sentence, you do not know that name, but I promise you, you know me, sent a strange chill through him, like a memory trying to surface from somewhere, just beneath conscious thought. He kept reading. 11 years ago, on a stretch of highway outside Bozeman, an old man's motorcycle broke down in the rain. His name was not important to the young men who passed him that evening. 3 of them slowed down, looked at him, and kept driving. A 4th vehicle passed and did not even slow. And then a man on a black Harley wearing the colors of a club I did not recognize pulled over without hesitation. Ethan's hands went cold. He remembered that night. He remembered it with a clarity that surprised him because it had been such a small thing at the time, such an unremarkable act, one of dozens of roadside repairs he'd done for strangers over the years. An old man on the shoulder of a rain-soaked highway, hazards blinking, standing beside a bike that had thrown its chain. Ethan had pulled over, fixed it in 20 minutes flat, refused the $20. The old man tried to press into his hand, and ridden off into the rain before the man could even properly thank him. He had never thought about that night again. Not once. It had been nothing to him, just a man helping another man the way bikers were supposed to help each other, the way Ethan had been taught since the day he first put on a set of colors. But apparently it had not been nothing to the old man on that highway. I was that old man, the letter continued. And I spent the better part of a decade trying to find you because a man who stops for a stranger in the rain, asking nothing in return, is a rarer thing in this world than people like to believe. And I wanted to know who you were. What I found when I finally learned your name surprised me more than the kindness itself. I learned that you had once been a respected man in your club, trusted, well-liked, a man other men followed. And I learned that you lost all of it deliberately on purpose because you chose to protect someone who could not protect themselves, even when it meant your own brothers turned against you and cast you out. Ethan's throat tightened. He set the letter down for a moment, pressing the heel of his hand against his eyes because he had not expected walking into the shop that morning to be confronted with the worst night of his life by a dead stranger's handwriting. He had never told anyone the full truth of what happened. Not Frank, not Duke, not really, not even back when they still spoke as brothers. He had let the town believe whatever story was easiest, because the truth involved a young woman named Callie Reyes, barely 19, at the time the girlfriend of a man high up in the club's hierarchy, a man who had been quietly, viciously abusing her for over a year, while everyone around them looked away because looking away was easier than confronting one of their own. Ethan hadn't looked away. He'd stepped in one night when it mattered most, pulled that man off her, and made sure Callie got out safely, got a bus ticket, got money, got somewhere far from that life. And when the club found out what he'd done, they hadn't seen a man protecting an innocent person. They'd seen a man who broke ranks, who chose an outsider over a brother who violated the code that held the whole fragile structure together. He'd been given a vote instead of a trial. He'd lost. He picked the letter back up, his hands trembling slightly now. I do not know the details of what happened. The letter continued as though Samuel Whitmore had read his mind across a decade in a grave. I only know the shape of it, that you paid a terrible price for doing the right thing, and that you have carried that price alone ever since. without a single person in this town understanding what it actually cost you. I built this shop with my own 2 hands 40 years ago. I built a life here, a good one, a life full of purpose. And in my final years, I made it my mission to find people like you, people who had sacrificed something precious to protect someone weaker than themselves, and who had been punished for it by a world that rarely rewards that kind of courage. I do not have children, Ethan. I never married. Everything I built alone, and for years I wondered what the point of any of it was if there was no one to hand it to when I was gone. Then I found you. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he turned the page and found the next section and the handwriting. Here was slightly different, shakier, written perhaps in a later, weaker season of Samuel Whitmore's life. This shop and everything inside it and everything connected to it was never meant to sit empty for 14 years. It was meant to wait. I arranged for the property to remain in a kind of legal limbo after my passing, unsellable to anyone, but through a very particular kind of auction, priced low enough and structured in a way I will explain further that would ensure it eventually fell into the hands of exactly the kind of person who would understand what to do with it. A person who would raise their hand for something everyone else had given up on, the way you once stopped your bike for a stranger everyone else had already passed by. If you are reading this, it means you did exactly that. Ethan sat in the creaking chair for a long moment, the letter trembling slightly in his grip, staring at the calendar on the wall frozen 14 years in the past, at the pristine motorcycles under their tarps, at the pegboard of tools, arranged like a museum exhibit, and felt the entire shape of his morning rearrange itself around a truth too large to fully hold at once. This building had not been abandoned. It had been waiting for him, specifically him, for over a decade. He flipped to the next page, hands unsteady, and found a single paragraph set apart from the rest, written in bold, deliberate strokes, as though Samuel Whitmore had wanted to make absolutely certain these particular words could not be missed or misunderstood. There is more here than a building, Ethan. There is a safe in the floor beneath the workbench, hidden under a steel plate you will need to look for carefully. Inside it is something that will change the rest of your life and the lives of people you have not met yet. But before you open it, I need you to understand something first. Because what is inside that safe is not a reward, it is a responsibility. And responsibilities like this one have a way of attracting exactly the kind of attention you do not want. There are people in this town, Ethan, who have known about this property far longer than you have. People who have been waiting for the day the legal limbo finally lifted so they could try to take what's inside before the right person ever got the chance to find it. I have done everything in my power to protect this place until now. From this point forward, that protection is yours. Ethan looked up sharply from the letter, his mind flashing immediately to the man in the gray coat at the auction house, phone in hand, texting someone for permission before deciding a $110 shop wasn't worth the paperwork. We have interest in a great deal of property on that side of town. Duke's warning in the parking lot suddenly didn't sound like idle gossip anymore. Harrington's been buying up half of Miller Street for 2 years. Quiet, careful, one property at a time. He set the letter down on the desk and sat very still, listening. The shop was silent except for the faint tick of settling metal somewhere in the old roof and his own heartbeat loud in his ears. For 14 years, this building had sat here, hiding something valuable enough that a dead man had structured a legal maze to protect it, valuable enough that a stranger's representative had shown genuine interest before walking away, valuable enough that Duke had looked genuinely worried standing in that parking lot. And Ethan had no idea yet what it actually was. He rose from the chair, walked back out onto the shop floor, and crouched down beside the workbench. Samuel's letter had described running his fingers along the concrete until he found it, a seam in the floor, nearly invisible unless you were searching for it, a rectangle of steel disguised under a thin layer of dust and old rubber matting. His pulse hammered as he pried at the edge of the plate with a flathead screwdriver from the pegboard, and it lifted with a metallic groan that seemed to echo through the entire empty building. Beneath it was a small steel door set into the concrete with a combination dial exactly like an old floor safe. Ethan crouched over it, staring at the dial, his mind racing back through the letter for any mention of numbers, any hint of the combination Samuel might have left him. He flipped back through the pages hurriedly, and near the very bottom of the last page, almost as an afterthought, he found a single line. The combination is the date you stopped for a stranger on a rainy highway and asked for nothing in return. You may not remember the exact date. I do. I have never forgotten a single detail of that night because it was the night I decided my life's work still had meaning. Ethan sat back on his heels, staring at the safe, his mind racing backward through years of memory to find a date he had genuinely never thought to hold on to, because at the time, it had felt like nothing. Just a small kindness on a rainy road forgotten by morning. He closed his eyes and let the memory come fully, now no longer just a fragment. The old man had been soaked to the bone hazard lights, blinking weakly in the downpour, 3 cars already gone past without slowing. Ethan remembered pulling his bike onto the shoulder, remembered the old man's voice shaking with cold and embarrassment. "You don't have to stop, son," the old man had said. Everybody else didn't. "Everybody else was in a hurry," Ethan had answered, already crouching beside the broken chain. "I'm not. Let me pay you something, anything. Keep your money. Get home dry." The old man had stood there in the rain a moment longer, studying Ethan's face like he was trying to memorize it before finally nodding and swinging his leg back over the repaired bike. "I won't forget this," he'd said, quiet enough that Ethan almost hadn't heard him over the rain. Ethan opened his eyes back in the present, alone in the dead man's shop, and felt something crack open in his chest. He hadn't forgotten either. He had just never understood until this very moment that it had mattered to anyone but him. Except it hadn't been nothing. It had been the beginning of something that was only now 14 years later, finally catching up to him, and as he knelt there on the cold concrete floor of a shop that had been waiting for him his entire adult life, staring at a locked safe holding a secret. A dead man had died. Protecting Ethan Walker understood with a certainty that settled deep into his bones that the $12.30 building the whole town had laughed at him for buying was about to change absolutely everything. He reached for the dial with a hand that would not stop shaking. Outside, unnoticed, a black sedan with tinted windows had pulled quietly to the curb across the street. Inside it, a man in the same gray coat from the auction house lowered his phone from his ear just long enough to glance at the darkened windows of the shop, then lifted it again. "He's inside," the man said quietly. "Found the office already by the look of it. Won't be long before he finds the rest." He paused, listening to whatever answer came back on the other end. "No," he said. "He doesn't know what he's sitting on. Not yet, but he will." He ended the call, set the phone in the cup holder, and settled back to wait, his eyes never leaving the shop's front door. Inside, kneeling on the cold concrete with the safe's dial cool beneath his fingers, Ethan had no idea he was being watched at all. He turned the dial slowly, one number at a time, his mind reaching back through 14 years to a rainy night he had almost let himself forget. And as the final number clicked into place and something inside the steel door released with a heavy metallic groan, Ethan Walker understood that the $12.30 shop the whole town had laughed at him for buying held a truth far bigger and far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The steel door swung open with a groan that seemed to shake something loose in Ethan's chest, and for a moment he simply knelt there on the cold concrete, staring into the dark space beneath the floor, not quite ready to reach inside. It wasn't money. His hand found a thick leather ledger. First, its cover worn soft from years of handling, and beneath it a smaller metal lockbox, and beneath that a single brass key tied to a length of twine with a tag that read, in the same careful handwriting, from the letter, "Do not open the third room until you understand the first 2. "Third room," Ethan muttered to himself, glancing around the shop floor like a third room might simply announce itself. "What third room?" He pulled the ledger into the light from the front windows and opened it carefully, the spine cracking with age. Page after page was filled with names, dates, and dollar amounts. Modest sums, 500, here 2,000. There sometimes just a note that read, "Paid in full." No interest, no questions. Beside many of the names, Samuel Whitmore had written a single line describing what the money had gone toward. Tuition for Marcus' second semester. New brakes and a deposit for Diane's first apartment. Bail and a lawyer for Calvin because a man deserves one mistake. Ethan sat back against the workbench, the ledger open across his knees, and felt something heavy settle into his stomach. This wasn't a shop. It had never really been a shop, not in the way the town understood it. It was the front door to something much larger. Something Samuel Whitmore had built quietly, patiently for decades, hidden behind grease and chrome and the reputation of a simple small-town mechanic. He opened the lockbox next, and inside found roughly $4,000 in cash bundled with a rubber band, along with a folded document that made his breath catch when he unfolded it. It was a deed, a second deed separate from the one he'd received at the auction for a parcel of land 2 miles outside town, 40 acres currently held in a trust under a name Ethan didn't recognize. Attached to it was a business card, cream-colored, slightly yellowed, for an attorney named Rosalind Pike, with an address downtown and a handwritten note in Samuel's script. She has been paid in advance for 15 years to wait for you. Go to her when you're ready and not one day before. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and Ethan nearly dropped the ledger in surprise. It was Frank. "You alive over there?" Frank asked, only half joking. "I'm alive," Ethan said, standing up slowly, his mind still spinning through everything spread across the workbench in front of him. "You didn't answer this morning." "I was in the shop." "Find anything worth the $110? Frank asked, and there was an edge of genuine curiosity beneath the teasing. Ethan looked at the $4,000 sitting in the open lockbox, at the ledger full of names, and quiet generosity at the deed to 40 acres he hadn't known existed an hour ago. "Yeah," he said slowly. "I think I did." "That's good, because Friday's still Friday." "I know, Frank. I'll have your rent by tonight." There was a pause on the line long enough that Ethan could hear Frank exhale. "Tonight, Ethan, 3 days ago, you were counting quarters." "Things changed," Ethan said. "I'll explain when I see you." He hung up before Frank could ask anything else, because he didn't yet have words for what had actually happened. And some tiny cautious part of him, the part that had survived 14 years of hard lessons, told him not to say too much to anyone until he understood what he was actually holding. Outside in the black sedan across the street, the man in the gray coat watched Ethan move past the front window with the lockbox in his hands and lifted his phone again. "He's found something," the man said. "Cash at minimum, possibly documents." "How much cash?" The voice on the other end was clipped, impatient, used to being obeyed. "Can't say for certain. Enough that he made a phone call right after and sounded like a different man." A long silence on the line. "Victor isn't going to like this." "Victor doesn't have to like it," the man in gray said. "He just has to decide how badly he wants that parcel before Walker figures out what it's actually worth." He ended the call and settled back against the seat, watching the shop's front door with the patient stillness of a man who had done this kind of waiting many times before. Inside, Ethan carried the ledger and the lockbox back to the office, locked them in the top drawer of the desk, out of habit more than any real sense of security, and stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking back out at the shop floor, at the tarped motorcycles, the photograph wall, the seam in the concrete where the safe still sat open. "Third room," he thought again. What third room? He walked the perimeter of the building, slowly running his hand along the walls, tapping here and there, the way he'd seen contractors do on television, feeling foolish and desperate in equal measure. Nothing gave, no hollow sound, no hidden seam, nothing except cinder block and old paint in the accumulated silence of 14 years. He was about to give up when he noticed the tool room. It was small, tucked behind the office, easy to miss, a closet-sized space lined with shelving that held spare parts, old rags, cans of grease, gone solid with age. But the shelving unit along the back wall sat slightly crooked. One edge pulled a few inches from the wall, in a way that shelving units bolted properly should never sit. Ethan gripped the edge of the shelf and pulled, and it swung outward on a hinge he hadn't noticed, revealing a narrow doorway behind it, and beyond that doorway a set of stairs leading down into darkness. His heart slammed against his ribs. "Okay," he said out loud to no one, his voice tight. "Okay, Samuel, what did you build down there?" He found a flashlight on the pegboard, tested it, and started down the stairs slowly. Each step creaking under his weight, the air growing cooler and older with every foot he descended. At the bottom, his flashlight beam swept across a room that stopped him cold. It wasn't a basement, it was an archive. Filing cabinets lined every wall, dozens of them, each labeled with years going back decades. A long table ran down the center of the room, covered in more photographs, more ledgers, and at the far end, mounted on the wall like a piece of art, a hand-drawn map of the county with red pins scattered across it. Dozens of pins, each one marking a location, each one connected by string to a name written on an index card pinned up beside it. Ethan approached the map slowly, his flashlight beam trembling slightly as he read the names. Marcus Reed Bozeman, Diane Carter Helena, Calvin Brooks, right here in town, on an address Ethan recognized as an apartment complex 2 streets over from his own garage. Calvin Brooks lived 2 streets away from him, had lived there possibly for years, without either of them ever knowing the thread that connected them. He kept reading, and near the bottom of the map, in a section slightly apart from the rest, he found a red pin with no string attached to it at all, floating alone unconnected, and beside it a name that made his stomach drop straight through the floor. Ethan Walker. No address, no string, just his name, and beneath it a single word in Samuel's handwriting: waiting. He stood there in the cold basement archive for a long moment, staring at his own name pinned to a dead man's wall, and felt the full dizzying weight of how long he had been a part of this story without ever knowing it existed. Calvin Brooks lived 2 streets away. Ethan knew the address the moment he read it, a low brick apartment complex he passed nearly every day without a second thought. He climbed the basement stairs, locked the shop behind him, and drove there before he'd fully decided to some instinct pulling him forward faster than his own caution could catch up. He knocked on Unit 14, and the man who opened the door was older than Ethan expected, maybe 60, gray stubble, a faded flannel shirt, and eyes that carried the particular tiredness of a man who'd worked with his hands his whole life and had little left to show for it. "Can I help you?" Calvin asked, wary in the way small-town strangers often were with each other. "My name's Ethan Walker. I bought the Old Harley Shop on Miller Street yesterday, Samuel Whitmore's shop." Something changed in Calvin's face instantly, a flicker of grief quickly followed by something sharper, almost like fear. "Samuel's been dead 6 years," he said carefully. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because your name's in his files," Ethan said. "A note about bail money, a lawyer. It said you deserved one mistake." Calvin's hand tightened on the doorframe, and for a moment Ethan thought the man might simply close the door in his face. Instead, his eyes went wet, and he looked away down the hallway, blinking hard. "That man saved my life," he said quietly. "Got me out of a cell I'd have rotted in, otherwise over a fight that wasn't even my fault, and never once let me thank him for it properly before he passed." "He wanted the shop rebuilt," Ethan said, "into something bigger than it was. I don't fully understand it yet, but I know I can't do it alone, and your name was on a wall down there like it mattered." Calvin studied him for a long, silent moment, the way a man studies something he's afraid to hope is real. "You serious about this, or are you just some fool who bought a building and got curious about the ghost stories?" "I turned down $200,000 this morning to keep that shop standing," Ethan said. "I'm serious." Something settled in Calvin's expression, then not quite trust, not yet, but the first loosening of a door that had been shut for a long time. "I haven't touched an engine in 3 years," he said. "Nobody wants to hire a 60-year-old ex-con mechanic, no matter how good his hands still are." "I do," Ethan said. "Come by the shop this week. No promises yet. Just come look." Calvin didn't answer right away, but he didn't close the door either, and as Ethan walked back to his truck, he felt for the first time since the auctioneer's gavel had come down that Samuel Whitmore's impossible plan might actually be something he could build. A sound from upstairs broke the silence back at the shop later that afternoon, the unmistakable creak of the front door opening. Ethan's whole body went rigid. He'd only just unlocked the front door himself moments earlier, distracted and hadn't thought to throw the bolt behind him. Anyone could have walked in. "Hello," a voice called from above, male, unfamiliar, smooth in a way that immediately put Ethan on edge. "Mr. Walker, are you here?" Ethan clicked off the flashlight, plunging the basement into darkness, and stood absolutely still, listening to footsteps cross the shop floor above him. "I know you're here," the voice continued, closer now, almost directly above the hidden stairway. "Your truck's outside. Let's not waste each other's time." Ethan made a decision in half a second, the same instinct that had once pulled him off a highway. For a stranger in the rain, he wasn't going to hide in a basement in his own building. He climbed the stairs quickly, pushed the shelving unit closed behind him with a soft click, and walked out into the shop floor to find a man in an expensive charcoal suit standing near the tarped, panhead hands clasped behind his back, studying the bike with the detached interest of an appraiser. "You must be Mr. Walker," the man said, turning with an easy, practiced smile. "Grant Weller. I work with Victor Harrington." "You're trespassing, Mr. Weller," Ethan said. The door was unlocked. "Doesn't make it an invitation." Weller's smile didn't waver. "Fair enough. I'll be brief then. Mr. Harrington is prepared to offer you $200,000 for this property, as is no inspection required closing within the week. That's roughly 1,800 times what you paid for it yesterday." The number hit Ethan harder than he expected, a cold, dizzying jolt. but he kept his face still the way he'd learned to do a long time ago in rooms full of men who wanted something from him. Not interested. Weller tilted his head slightly as though recalibrating. You haven't heard the number wrong. $200,000. I heard it fine. Most people in your position would take that deal before I finished the sentence. I'm not most people, Ethan said, and something in his voice made Weller's smile finally slip, just slightly. Let me be more direct, Mr. Walker. Mr. Harrington has been assembling this block for 2 years. Every other property has already sold. Yours is the last piece, and it's sitting directly in the middle of a development that's going to bring $411 million in tax revenue to the Weston County. You standing here refusing a fair offer out of what sentiment is not going to stop that development. It's only going to slow it down and make things considerably less pleasant for you personally. Is that a threat? It's a forecast, Weller said smoothly. Mr. Harrington's attorneys are very good at their jobs. Mr. Walker in this county has a long list of code violations tied to this building that nobody's enforced in 14 years, simply because nobody cared enough to check. That could change very quickly if this conversation doesn't go well. Weller let the silence sit a moment before he added almost gently, We did some homework on you, of course. Standard practice before an acquisition. Interesting history of guy Mr. Walker, a motorcycle club that voted you out over some incident involving a young woman named Callie Reyes. Most people in this town don't even know that name. I imagine you'd rather it stayed that way. Ethan went very still. That's got nothing to do with this. Everything's connected to something if you dig deep enough, Weller said, watching Ethan's face carefully the way a man watches for a crack he's just found in a foundation. I'm not threatening you, Mr. Walker. I'm simply pointing out that a man with a complicated past standing in the way of 400 local jobs is not a sympathetic story no matter how many old motorcycles he's got sitting under tarps. People believe what they're told to believe, and Mr. Harrington has a very good public relations team. Ethan felt the old familiar heat rising in his chest, the same heat that had gotten him thrown out of a clubhouse 11 years ago, and this time he didn't fight it. Get out of my shop, Mr. Weller. Weller studied him for a long moment, and something almost like respect flickered behind his eyes before it disappeared again. You should know something about Victor Harrington before you make an enemy of him, he said, moving toward the door. He doesn't lose. He's just occasionally patient about winning. He paused at the threshold, glancing back at the tarped motorcycles at the photograph wall he clearly hadn't noticed on the way in. Whatever Whitmore left you in here, Mr. Walker, I hope it's worth what it's going to cost you. He walked out, and a moment later, Ethan heard the black sedan pull away from the curb. He hadn't even caught his breath before a familiar truck rumbled to a stop outside, and Duke Ferris climbed out, jaw-tight eyes scanning the street like he was checking for something. You know who that was? Duke asked, pushing through the door without waiting to be invited in. Grant Weller, works for Harrington. I know who he works for, Duke said. I saw his car parked outside the diner an hour ago, talking to 2 guys from my chapter about paving contracts for whatever Harrington's building on Miller Street. I came straight here when I saw him pull away from your shop. Ethan studied his old friend for a long moment, something guarded still sitting behind his eyes. Why do you care, Duke? You made it pretty clear yesterday this wasn't your business anymore. Duke's jaw worked for a second before he answered. Because I voted with everybody else 11 years ago, and I've regretted it every day since, and I never had the nerve to say that to your face until right now. He exhaled hard like the words had cost him something to get out. I didn't raise my hand against you, Ethan. I also didn't raise it for you. I just stood there and let the room decide because I was young and scared of losing my patch, and that's a coward's excuse, and I know it. Ethan didn't answer right away. 11 years of silence didn't dissolve in a single sentence, no matter how honest it sounded. What did Weller want? Duke asked softer now. $200,000 for the shop, then a list of code violations if I said no. Duke let out a low whistle. And you said no. I said no. You always were an idiot, Duke said, but there was no meanness in it now. Only something that sounded almost like admiration. Whatever's really going on here, Ethan and I can see in your face there's more to it than an Old Harley Shop. You're going to need people who aren't scared of Harrington's money. I know men on my crew who'd help rebuild this place. For the right reason, quietly off the books if you asked. Why would you offer that? Duke looked around the shop floor at the tarped bikes at the photograph wall. He clearly hadn't noticed yet, and something in his expression softened. Because 11 years ago, you gave up everything you had to protect somebody who couldn't protect herself, and I've spent every day since wondering what kind of man I'd have been if I'd done the same. Guess I'm asking for a chance to find out now if you'll let me." Ethan felt something loosen in his chest that had been clenched tight for over a decade. "I'll let you know," he said quietly. "Give me a few days to understand what I'm actually building before I ask anyone to help me build it." Duke nodded, clapped him once on the shoulder, and left without pushing further, and Ethan stood alone in the shop for a long moment afterward, feeling the strange, unfamiliar sensation of an old wound beginning very slowly to close. He looked down at his own hands, steady now, in a way they hadn't been an hour earlier. Something had shifted in him during that conversation with Weller, some old certainty reasserting itself after years of dormancy. He had refused $200,000 he desperately needed, standing in a building he'd owned for less than a day, because some dead man's handwriting had convinced him this place mattered more than money. He didn't fully understand why yet, but he trusted the feeling anyway. He locked the front door properly, this time went back down into the basement archive, and spent the next several hours going through the filing cabinets. One drawer at a time, reading names he didn't recognize, and a handful he did old customers, old acquaintances, people from around town whose lives had apparently intersected with Samuel Whitmore's quiet, invisible generosity without Ethan ever knowing it. By the time he emerged, the light outside had shifted toward evening, and his phone showed 3 missed calls from Frank. He drove to Frank's house, directly the $4,000 from the lockbox folded into an envelope on the passenger seat, and knocked on the door with a strange mixture of relief and unease sitting heavy in his chest. Frank opened the door, took one look at Ethan's face, and said, "You look like you saw a ghost." "Something like that," Ethan said, and handed him the envelope. 2 months back rent, plus this month in advance. Count it if you want." Frank took the envelope, slowly weighing it in his hand, like he didn't quite trust it to be real. "Where'd this come from, Ethan?" "The shop," Ethan said. "There was more inside than I expected. More cash, more everything." Frank studied him for a long moment, the same way people had been studying Ethan all day, trying to see something new in a face they thought they already understood. "You want to come in, have a beer, tell me what's really going on?" Ethan almost said yes. He almost let himself sit down in Frank's kitchen and unload the entire impossible day. The auction, the letter, the ledger, the basement archive, the man in the charcoal suit offering $200,000 like it was nothing. But some instinct held him back, the same instinct that had told him not to say too much to anyone yet. "Not tonight," he said. "I've got some things I need to sort out first." Frank nodded slowly, not pushing, though Ethan could see the question still sitting behind his eyes. "Whatever's going on, Ethan, be careful. This town's got a way of chewing up men who suddenly come into money nobody can explain." "I'll be careful," Ethan said, and meant it, though he had no real idea yet what being careful was even going to require. He drove back to the garage that night, instead of the shop, needing the familiar smallness of his own rented space after a day that had cracked his entire understanding of his life wide open. He lay on the thin mattress, staring at the water-stained bird on the ceiling, and pulled out the business card Samuel had left him. Rosalind Pike, attorney at law, turning it over in his fingers again and again, like it might reveal something new each time. He called first thing the next morning. "Pike and Associates," a woman's voice answered, brisk and professional. "I need to speak with Rosalind Pike," Ethan said. "My name is Ethan Walker. I think she's been expecting my call." There was a brief pause on the line, and when the woman spoke again, her voice had changed, softened, carrying a note of something that sounded almost like relief. "Mr. Walker, yes, please hold." A moment later, a different voice came on the line, older, measured, carrying the calm authority of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms. "Mr. Walker, this is Rosalind Pike. I have to say I've been waiting a very long time for this phone call." "Then you know who I am," Ethan said, "because I'm still trying to figure that out myself." A dry, quiet laugh came through the line. "I imagine you are. Can you come to my office this afternoon? There's a great deal I need to explain, and some of it, frankly, doesn't have much time left to wait." "What do you mean doesn't have much time left?" Rosalind's voice grew more serious. "Mr. Walker, Samuel Whitmore, structured his estate very carefully to protect that property until the right person claimed it. But that protection isn't permanent, and there are people in this town who have spent years trying to find a legal way around it. As of yesterday, when your name went on that deed, a clock started running that I need to explain to you in person. 3 o'clock, please don't be late. The line went dead and Ethan sat on the edge of his mattress phone, still in his hand, feeling the strange sensation of his entire life accelerating past him faster than he could keep up. He arrived at Rosalind Pike's office at 2:45, too anxious to sit still anywhere else, and found her waiting for him behind a large oak desk cluttered with folders, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and silver hair, pulled back into a tight, businesslike knot. "Sit down, Mr. Walker," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "I'm going to tell you a story, and I need you to let me finish it before you ask questions, because it's a lot to absorb and interrupting it will only make it harder to follow." Ethan sat. "Samuel Whitmore was my client for over 20 years, Rosalind began. "In that time, I watched him give away more money than most wealthy men spend on themselves in a lifetime, always quietly, always without wanting credit. He helped people rebuild their lives after prison, after addiction, after every kind of hardship this county produces. He never asked for anything in return, except one thing, that they eventually passed the same kindness forward in whatever way they could." "I found the ledger," Ethan said. "The names, Marcus Diane Calvin." Rosalind nodded. "Then you understand the scope of it, at least partially. What you may not understand is why he structured things the way he did: the auction, the legal limbo, the 14 years of waiting." She leaned forward slightly. 11 years ago, shortly after you helped him on that highway, Samuel began quietly investigating you. Not out of suspicion, out of hope. He'd spent years searching for someone who embodied exactly the values he'd built his entire philosophy around, and he believed almost immediately that he'd found it in you. "So why didn't he just tell me?" Ethan asked, unable to hold the question back. "Why hide it behind an auction, a locked safe, 14 years of nothing?" Rosalind's expression tightened. "Because 3 years after that night on the highway, Victor Harrington approached Samuel with an offer for this property, a very large offer, larger than anything Samuel needed, because by then Harrington had already begun assembling that block of Miller Street for his development. Samuel refused. Harrington did not take the refusal well. What did he do? He tried to have Samuel declared mentally incompetent," Rosalind said flatly, "in an attempt to seize control of his assets through the courts. It nearly worked. Samuel spent almost 2 years and a considerable amount of money fighting that petition, and he won, but the experience frightened him badly. He understood after that simply owning the property wasn't enough protection. He needed a structure that would survive even his own death, one that Harrington's lawyers couldn't touch, one that would deliver the property directly into hands Harrington couldn't predict or manipulate in advance." Ethan felt something cold settle into his stomach. "The auction." "The auction," Rosalind confirmed, "structured through a private legal mechanism priced deliberately low to discourage serious buyers, timed to occur only after a very specific set of conditions were met following Samuel's death. It was designed quite literally to make sure the property would end up in the hands of someone who wanted it for reasons that had nothing to do with money, because Samuel believed correctly that Harrington's people would underestimate exactly that kind of buyer. And they did," Ethan said quietly, remembering Weller's dismissive glance at the auction. "We'll let this one go, not worth the paperwork." "They did," Rosalind agreed, "for about 18 hours. What happens now?" Rosalind pulled a thick folder from her desk drawer and slid it across to him. "Now, Mr. Walker, you need to understand what you actually own, because it is considerably more than a shop and 40 acres of land. Samuel established a trust 9 years ago, funded initially with $2.1 million invested, conservatively grown, modestly over time. As of last month's statement, that trust holds just over $3 million. Ethan's ears rang. $3 million. $3 million, Rosalind repeated, watching his face carefully. Designated in Samuel's own words for the continuation of what he started, rebuilding that shop into something larger than a repair business, a place for people the rest of this town has already given up on. You are named as sole trustee, Mr. Walker, effective the moment you claim the property, which means the money is yours to direct, but not yours to simply take. There are conditions. What conditions? The trust requires that the funds be used specifically to rebuild and operate the property according to Samuel's stated mission, under your direct oversight, for a minimum of 5 years before any personal disbursement becomes available to you. If you attempt to sell the property, liquidate the trust, or abandon the mission within that period, the entire trust reverts automatically to a designated charitable foundation, and you forfeit any claim to it permanently. Ethan sat back in his chair, the folder heavy and unopened in his lap. his mind struggling to hold the full shape of what he was being told. $3 million. Not his to spend, his to build with. He really thought I was going to do this, Ethan said quietly, almost to himself. He was certain of it, Rosalind said, her voice softening for the first time since he'd sat down. He told me once near the end that he'd met a lot of good men in his life, but very few who'd give up everything for a stranger and never once think to mention it to anyone afterward. He said that was the kind of man worth building a legacy around. Ethan looked down at the folder at his own hands resting on top of it and felt the weight of an entire dead man's faith pressing down on him, heavier and more frightening than any threat Grant Weller had made that morning. There's something else you need to know, Rosalind said, and her tone shifted again, sharper now, more urgent. Harrington's people will have discovered the trust's existence by now, or they will very soon. These things rarely stay quiet for long. Once a name appears on public deed records, and I need to be honest with you about something Samuel worried about more than almost anything else. What's that? The trust has a vulnerability, Rosalind said. A clause Samuel insisted on including over my objections at the time that allows the county to reclaim the property through eminent domain if it can be demonstrated that the property poses a documented public safety hazard and the trustee fails to remedy it within 90 days of formal notice. She paused, letting that settle. Weller mentioned code violations to you this morning, didn't he? Ethan's stomach dropped. How did you know that? Because it's exactly what I would do if I were trying to dismantle a trust I couldn't touch through normal legal channels, Rosalind said grimly. Harrington doesn't need to buy that property from you anymore, Mr. Walker. If he can get the county to condemn it as a safety hazard, he can take it from you entirely, and there won't be a single thing Samuel's trust can do to stop him. The room went very quiet. 90 days, Ethan repeated slowly. 90 days from formal notice, Rosalind confirmed. Which means if Harrington moves as quickly as I suspect he will, you may have considerably less time than that to bring this property up to code, rebuild whatever's necessary, and demonstrate to this county that Samuel's mission is real and already underway. Not just words on paper, but people walking through that door building something worth protecting. Rosalind reached into a second folder on her desk and slid a single sheet of county letterhead across to him, and Ethan's stomach dropped the moment he saw the date stamped in the corner. This came into my office by courier an hour before you called this morning, she said quietly. I wasn't going to show it to you until you understood the full picture, but I think you're ready now. Ethan picked it up with hands that had gone cold. Notice of Code Compliance Inspection, it read across the top, followed by the address of the shop, and beneath that, a list of preliminary concerns filed by an anonymous complainant: outdated electrical wiring, unpermitted structural modifications, insufficient fire egress. At the bottom, a scheduled inspection date 11 days out and a line that made his throat tighten. Failure to remedy documented violations within the statutory period may result in condemnation proceedings. He filed this before I even walked into that auction house, Ethan said slowly, doing the math in his head. This complaint predates me owning the building by hours, which tells you Harrington's people didn't just discover this opportunity yesterday, Rosalind said grimly. They've had this filed and ready for months, waiting for the legal limbo to lift, expecting whoever bought that property to fold the moment real pressure arrived. They weren't prepared for you to refuse $200,000 this morning, which means they'll move faster now, not slower. 11 days, Ethan repeated. 11 days until inspection, Rosalind said. Not until condemnation. But if that inspector walks in and finds exactly what this complaint describes, and knowing that building's age, he very well might, the clock on the 90 days starts immediately, and Harrington's team will be positioned to argue non-compliance well before you're anywhere close to finished. Ethan sat with that for a long moment, the notice trembling faintly in his grip, the same way the letter from Samuel had trembled in his hands less than 24 hours earlier. So I need electricians, inspectors of my own, contractors fast before theirs gets there first. You need exactly that, Rosalind said. And you need people this county already trusts standing beside you when that inspector walks through the door, because paperwork alone won't be enough to convince anyone that a Hell's Angel with a checkered past deserves the benefit of the doubt. You'll need this town to see with their own eyes that something good is actually happening inside those walls. Ethan sat in the silence of that office, the folder heavy in his lap, $3 million and a dead man's faith resting on his shoulders. A countdown he hadn't known existed already. quietly ticking somewhere in a county office he'd never set foot in, and understood with a clarity that settled cold and absolute into his chest. That buying a $12 shop nobody wanted had somehow made him the only thing standing between Victor Harrington and everything Samuel Whitmore had spent his entire life building. "Where do I start?" he asked quietly. Rosalind Pike smiled for the first time since he'd sat down, small-tired but genuine. "You start, Mr. Walker, the same way Samuel always said everything worth doing starts. You find the people who need a second chance and you give them one before anyone with more money than conscience finds a way to take that chance away from all of you." Ethan drove straight from her office back to Miller Street, the county notice folded in his jacket pocket, his mind already racing through names Duke's crew Calvin, whoever else Samuel's ledger might lead him to when he rounded the corner and saw the shop's front door from half a block away. Something orange was taped across it. His hands tightened on the wheel. He pulled to the curb faster than he meant to, left the truck running, and crossed the sidewalk in a few long strides, his pulse climbing with every step. Up close, the orange paper resolved into an official county, form block letters stamped across the top in heavy black ink. Notice of scheduled inspection property, subject to review under Municipal Safety Code. Beneath it, a date had been handwritten in not 11 days out, the way Rosalind's copy had shown less than an hour earlier, but 4 days out, the number scrawled in ink so fresh it had barely dried. Someone had already changed the timeline. Ethan stood on the sidewalk with his hand pressed flat against the door, staring at that date, and felt the full shape of the fight ahead of him settle into his chest like a stone dropped into still water. 4 days to somehow begin proving to an entire county that a $12 shop and everything hidden inside it was worth saving before someone with far more money and far less conscience made absolutely certain it never got the chance. 4 days. Ethan stood on that sidewalk with his hand still pressed flat against the orange notice, feeling the number burn itself into his mind, and then he did something he hadn't let himself do in 11 years. He stopped calculating the odds and just moved. He had Rosalind on the phone before he'd even climbed back into his truck. "They moved the date," he said, no greeting, his voice tight. 11 days on your copy, 4 days on the one taped to my door." A sharp breath came through the line. "That's not supposed to be possible without a formal amendment filed through the clerk's office." "Read me exactly what it says." Ethan read it to her word for word, his hand shaking just slightly around the phone. "That's not a clerical error, Mr. Walker," Rosalind said grimly after a long pause. "Someone with access changed that date on purpose. I can file a motion to challenge the amendment, but motions take time you don't have. And by the time a judge even looks at it, that inspector's already walked through your door either way. So what do I do?" "You stop wasting time asking me that question," Rosalind said, "and you start calling every person who might help you make that building pass inspection in 4 days, because right now that is the only fight you can actually win." Ethan hung up and sat behind the wheel for exactly 10 seconds, staring at the shop through the windshield, and then he started dialing. Duke picked up on the second ring. "Miss me already?" "4 days, Ethan said. "Inspectors coming in 4 days, not 11. Someone moved it up on purpose. I need your crew tonight, Duke. Tonight, not tomorrow." There was no hesitation on the other end at all. "I'll have 6 guys there by 7. Electrical framing, a guy who used to do fire code inspections for the county before he retired. What else do you need?" "Everything," Ethan said. "I need everything." "Then we'll bring everything," Duke said, and the line went dead before Ethan could even thank him. He called Calvin next, and the older man answered on the first ring like he'd been sitting by the phone. "You said come by this week," Calvin said before Ethan could speak. "I'm guessing this week just turned into tonight." "How'd you know that?" "Because good news doesn't usually sound the way you sounded when I opened my door yesterday," Calvin said. "I'll grab my old toolbox. Give me 20 minutes. Ethan sat in the truck a moment longer after that call, something tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with fear. 2 men strangers to each other 24 hours ago, both dropping everything the moment he asked because a dead man had quietly decided years before either of them knew it that they belonged to the same story. A colder thought followed close behind the warm one. He had $4,000 in cash and a crew about to descend on the building, expecting wiring, lumber permits, fixtures. None of it cheap, all of it needed within days, not weeks. He called Rosalind back before he lost his nerve. "I need to know if I can touch the trust for this," he said. Materials, permits, whatever it costs to pass that inspection? Or does pulling money this fast violate the 5-year condition you told me about? Read the clause again in your head, Mr. Walker, Rosalind said, not unkindly. The trust exists specifically to rebuild and operate the property according to Samuel's mission. Emergency repairs to prevent condemnation is about as squarely inside that mission as anything could be. I'll authorize a draw first thing in the morning up to $20,000, and I'll document every dollar myself so there's no question later about how it was spent. Anything beyond that, call me first. 20,000, Ethan repeated, still not fully used to numbers like that belonging to him, even conditionally. Spend it like it's not yours, Rosalind said. Because in 5 years, if you do this right, it still won't be. It'll belong to everyone who ever walks through that door needing what Samuel gave you. A pause, softer. Go save your building, Mr. Walker. He pulled the ledger from the office drawer before anyone arrived and flipped through it one more time, searching for names. Rosalind hadn't mentioned names the map downstairs hadn't fully explained. Marcus Reed Bozeman. He found a phone number scrawled in the margin beside the entry, faded but legible, and dialed it before he could talk himself out of it. A woman answered. Reed Motorcycle and Custom, this is Angie. I'm looking for Marcus Reed, Ethan said. My name's Ethan Walker. I bought Samuel Whitmore's old shop. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Ethan almost thought the call had dropped. Then a man's voice came on low and guarded. This is Marcus. Samuel left a note about you, Ethan said carefully, unsure how much to say to a stranger who might hang up any second. Said he paid your tuition once. Second semester of something. Another silence, heavier this time. Samuel's been dead 6 years, Marcus said finally. Why is someone calling me about him now out of nowhere using a number I haven't given out in a decade? Because he built something before he died that I don't fully understand yet, and I'm running out of time to save it, Ethan said. There's a county inspector coming to condemn his shop in 4 days unless I can prove it's worth keeping. I found a wall down there with your name on it. Rebuilt. That's what it said under your picture. Marcus's breathing changed on the other end, slower, more careful. What picture? You standing next to an engine, grinning like you just won something. A long exhale. That was the day I finished my first solo rebuild under his roof, Marcus said quietly. 18 years old, no father, no direction, about 6 months from ending up in a cell like half the guys I grew up with. Samuel pulled me off a street corner and put a wrench in my hand instead, and never once asked for anything back. A pause. I own 3 shops now. Wouldn't own any of them if it wasn't for that man. He wanted this place rebuilt into something bigger, Marcus. A place for people like you were before you had somewhere to land. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. You're serious about this? Dead serious. I've got a crew coming tonight and 4 days to make an impossible building pass inspection, and I don't have anybody who actually knows how to run something like this at scale. I need somebody who's already done it. I've got a business to run, Walker. 3 locations, employees counting on me. I understand, Ethan said and meant it, letting the silence sit rather than pushing. Give me your address, Marcus said, finally, his voice rougher than before. I can be there by morning. I'm not promising anything beyond that. That's more than I had an hour ago, Ethan said and gave him the address. He tried Diane Carter's number next, found only a disconnected line, and spent 20 frustrating minutes searching through the old files until he found a more recent employer listed on a secondary card, a garage in Helena. The man who answered there told him gruffly that Diane hadn't worked there in over a year, hadn't left a forwarding number, and hung up before Ethan could ask anything else. He set that threat aside, frustrated, and told himself he'd come back to it. 2 out of 3 wasn't nothing. He sat alone for a moment in the quiet office the 20 minutes before Duke's crew was due to arrive, stretching out in front of him, and found himself, almost without deciding to, typing a name into his phone he hadn't let himself search in over a decade. Callie Reyes. His thumb hovered over the search button for a long time before he finally pressed it, half expecting nothing, but half afraid of exactly what he might find. What came back was a handful of results, a name that matched a small town, 2 states over, a photograph on a community center page showing a woman in her 30s standing beside a group of children at what looked like an after-school program. A caption underneath reading, Program Director Callie Reyes Hollis celebrates 5 years of the Bright Path Youth Center. Ethan sat staring at that photograph for a long time, throat tight. something in his chest finally settling after 11 years of never quite knowing if the price he'd paid had actually meant anything. She looked steady. She looked whole. She looked like a woman who had built an entire life out of the 20 minutes of safety he'd once bought her on a highway in the rain. Except this time it hadn't been a stranger he'd saved. It had been someone from his own world. And it had cost him everything he had. He didn't message her. He didn't know what he'd even say after 11 years of silence. And some part of him understood that whatever closure he needed didn't require her to provide it. It was enough in that quiet moment just to know. He set the phone down as headlights swept across the front windows and Duke's truck pulled up outside right on time. By 7 that evening, the shop that had sat silent for 14 years was loud in a way it probably hadn't been since Samuel Whitmore was alive. Duke's crew hauling in equipment, someone running extension cords, someone else already up on a ladder inspecting the old wiring with a flashlight clenched between his teeth. This wiring's from the Nixon administration. The retired inspector, a wiry old man named Pete Sorensen, announced within the first 10 minutes, shaking his head at the fuse box. Whoever built this place, God bless him, but this needs to be gutted and redone top to bottom, or that inspector's going to condemn it on site. How long? Ethan asked. Doing it right, 2 weeks easy. I've got 4 days. Pete looked at him for a long moment, then looked around at the 6 men already unloading tools, and something in his weathered face shifted. 4 days, he repeated slowly. Well, guess nobody told you it was impossible, so I won't bother either. He rolled up his sleeves. Get me 2 more guys who aren't afraid to work through the night, and maybe we don't embarrass ourselves. An hour into tearing out the old drywall near the back corner, one of Duke's men let out a sharp curse that brought half the crew running. He'd punched through a section of wall to find the support beam behind its soft and blackened water damage from some long-ago leak eating slowly through wood that should have been solid. That's load-bearing, Pete said grimly, running a flashlight along the length of it. If that goes during inspection, it's not a citation anymore. It's a condemnation on the spot, maybe worse. Ethan felt his stomach drop. Can we fix it in time? Depends how deep the rot runs. Pete pressed a screwdriver into the wood and it sank in far deeper than it should have. Could be isolated, could be the whole back wall's compromised behind that drywall. Won't know till we open the whole thing up. Then open it up, Ethan said. They worked for 2 hours straight after that, tearing back drywall along the entire rear wall, while Ethan held a flashlight with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking until Pete finally sat back on his heels and exhaled. Isolated to about 6 feet, he said. Bad luck, but manageable. Sister, the beam reinforced it properly, we're clean. He looked up at Ethan. You got lucky, son. Another 6 inches either direction, and we'd be talking about a very different 4 days. Duke clapped Ethan on the shoulder, sweat and dust streaked across his face. Welcome to old buildings, he said. They keep secrets, same as people do. Calvin arrived 20 minutes later with a toolbox that looked older than Ethan himself, and the moment he stepped through the door and saw the tarped panhead, he stopped dead in his tracks. That's his bike, Calvin said quietly, almost reverent. The one he never let anybody touch but himself. I used to watch him work on that thing through the window when I couldn't afford to come inside. Why couldn't you afford to come inside? Ethan asked, genuinely curious. Calvin's jaw tightened slightly. Fresh out on parole, no money, no truck, walk past this place every day, on my way to a job that barely paid enough for rent. Samuel caught me looking through that window one evening, and instead of running me off, he just propped the door open and said, Cold out there. Come warm up if you want. Never asked why I was on foot, never asked what I'd done time for. Just handed me a rag and pointed at a carburetor that needed cleaning. He shook his head slowly. Took me 3 visits before I even told him my name. It's yours to work on now if you want, Ethan said, nodding at the panhead. Something moved behind Calvin's eyes, grief, gratitude, something too complicated to name cleanly. Show me where you need me, he said, his voice thick, and got to work without another word. The night unfolded in a blur of motion and noise, wires stripped and replaced, drywall torn out, and framed fresh Duke barking friendly orders at his crew like he'd been running job sites his whole life, which Ethan realized somewhere around midnight he probably had. Somewhere in the middle of it, exhausted, covered in dust, Ethan found himself standing beside Duke near the workbench. Both of them staring at the wall of photographs neither had fully processed yet. You never told me any of this, Duke said quietly, nodding at the wall. Rebuilt, Rebuilt. Rebuilt. How many people is that? I don't know yet, Ethan admitted. I found a ledger with dozens of names. This whole basement's full of files on people Samuel helped over decades and nobody in this town ever knew. Duke shook his head slowly. Man hides in plain sight for 40 years quietly saving half this county, and everybody just thought he ran a motorcycle shop. He looked at Ethan sideways. Kind of reminds me of somebody else I know. Man everybody thought was just some washed-up biker fixing bikes out of a rented garage. Ethan didn't answer that, but something in his chest tightened in a way that wasn't entirely unpleasant. Around 1 in the morning, headlights swept across the front windows, and every man in the shop went still for half a second before recognizing the sound of an unfamiliar engine cutting off outside. Ethan stepped toward the door, attention coiling in his shoulders, half expecting Weller's sedan again. Instead, Marcus Reed walked in jacket, still on, looking like a man who'd driven 3 hours without stopping. You said morning? Ethan said, surprised. Couldn't sleep, Marcus said, simply glancing around at the crew, the torn open walls, the tarped bikes. Figured I'd rather lose sleep helping than lose sleep wondering if I should have. He didn't wait for an assignment. He walked straight to the electrical panel, took one look at what Pete and his crew were doing, and started directing traffic. Like he'd never left the trade, calling out measurements, catching a mistake in the wiring diagram before it became a problem. Moving through the space with the easy authority of a man who had built and rebuilt things his entire adult life. By 3 in the morning, exhaustion had settled into every man on that crew, but the shop's bones had already begun to change. Walls opened and reframed, new wiring, snaking clean and safe through the ceiling, the old rot finally being cut away and replaced with something built to last. That was when Ethan's phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. Careful how fast you're moving, Mr. Walker. Fast work gets sloppy and sloppy work fails inspections just as easily as neglect does. GW Ethan stared at the message for a long moment, his exhausted mind slow to catch up to the implication buried in it, and then it hit him with a jolt that snapped him fully awake. Weller knew exactly how fast they were working, which meant somebody was watching the shop right now in the dark close enough to see. Duke, Ethan called out, keeping his voice level. Kill the lights on the south side for a second. I need to check something outside. Duke frowned but didn't ask questions, motioning for one of his guys to cut the temporary lighting rig near the back windows. Ethan slipped out the side door into the dark moving quiet along the exterior wall, scanning the street. He found the man crouched behind a dumpster across the alley, phone raised, filming the shop through a gap in the fence. You want to explain what you're doing? Ethan said low and hard, stepping into the alley. The man, startled, nearly dropped his phone and turned to run, but Duke had already circled around from the other direction, cutting off the exit arms, crossed unimpressed. Nowhere to go, friend, Duke said pleasantly. I'm not doing anything illegal, the man said quickly, backing against the fence. Public street. I can film whatever I want. Who sent you? Ethan asked. The man's eyes flickered between them, calculating before something in Duke's expression apparently convinced him honesty was the faster way out. Guy named Weller, paying $200 a night to document anything that might look like a code violation. Unpermitted work, unlicensed contractors, whatever. Said it'd help some inspection go a certain way. Ethan felt something cold and furious settle into his chest. Get out of here, he said, and tell Weller I said thank you for the reminder to do everything by the book. The man didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled past them and disappeared down the alley, and Ethan stood there a moment with Duke breathing hard in the cold night air. They're not just watching, Duke said quietly. They're building a case. Then we make sure there's no case to build, Ethan said. Every permit, every inspection, everything done exactly right, starting right now. They went back inside and Ethan gathered the crew for 2 minutes, laying out what had just happened, watching the exhaustion on their faces sharpen into something more focused, more determined. Pete Sorensen, the retired inspector, pulled a battered notebook from his jacket and started documenting every single repair. As they made it, time-stamped, photographed, cross-referenced, against county, code building, and airtight paper trail, no lawyer could easily dismantle. Man's trying to sabotage us with technicalities, Pete muttered, snapping another photo of freshly stripped wiring. Fine, we'll out-technicality him. The black sedan rolled slowly past the shop the following afternoon, windows tinted, engine barely above idle, and every head on the crew turned to watch it pass without a single person saying a word. It didn't stop. It didn't need to. Weller wanted them to see it, to feel watched, to carry that small, cold weight through the rest of the day's work, and Ethan understood exactly what the gesture was. Worth nothing legally, everything psychologically. Ignore it! Ethan called out loud enough for the whole crew to hear, forcing steadiness into his voice he didn't entirely feel. He wants us rattled. We don't give him that. Duke spat on the sidewalk in the sedan's general direction, which broke enough of the tension that a few of the younger guys laughed and the crew turned back to their work hammers and drills, picking back up in a ragged, defiant rhythm that felt to Ethan like the loudest answer they could have given. Dawn broke gray and quiet over the shop, and by the time the sun was fully up, half the crew had gone home to sleep in shifts, and Ethan sat slumped against the workbench with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, watching Marcus double-check a junction box with the same intensity he must have brought to it 18 years earlier. As a scared kid, Samuel had pulled off a street corner. "You look like hell," Marcus said, not unkindly, settling down beside him. "Feel like it too." Marcus studied him for a moment. "You want to tell me why you're really doing this? Because a man doesn't turn down 200 grand and pull an all-nighter with strangers just because a dead guy left him a nice letter." Ethan turned the cold coffee cup in his hands, considering how much to say, and then for the first time since it happened, told someone outside the club the full truth: Cali Reyes, the vote, the 11 years of silence that followed. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable until Ethan finished. "You know what Samuel used to say to me," Marcus said finally, "back when I was young and angry and couldn't understand why he'd waste his time on somebody like me. He said the world's full of people who'll tell you exactly what you did wrong. Takes a rarer kind of person to notice what you did right, even when doing right cost you everything." He looked around the half-rebuilt shop at the crew scattered in exhausted heaps, at the photograph wall glowing faintly in the early light. "Guess he found another one of those people. Just took him longer to get here." Ethan didn't trust his voice enough to answer that directly. "3 more days," he said instead. "We're maybe a third of the way through what Pete says we need." "Then we better stop talking and start working," Marcus said, pushing himself back up. The second day moved faster than the first, fueled by adrenaline and the grim knowledge that Weller's people were still watching, still waiting for a mistake. Around noon, a delivery truck pulled up outside, and Ethan tensed on instinct before realizing it wasn't Harrington's people at all. It was a stack of donated lumber and drywall paid for and arranged according to the confused driver by someone named Frank Delgado. Ethan called him immediately. "Frank, you didn't have to do this. Heard from 3 different people you've got half the county's bikers rebuilding that old shop overnight," Frank said. "Figured if you're finally doing something worth doing, least I could do is not let you run out of drywall doing it." A pause warmer than Ethan expected. "Also heard Harrington's people are sniffing around trying to shut you down." "That true? That's true. Then you tell me if you need anything else," Frank said. "I've lived in this town my whole life, watching men like Harrington buy up everything worth having. Wouldn't mind seeing somebody finally push back." Frank showed up himself an hour later, still in his work clothes, and stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the torn open walls and the exhausted, determined faces before he rolled up his sleeves. "I don't know the first thing about wiring," he admitted to Ethan, "but I can carry lumber and I can hold a ladder steady, and apparently that's worth something tonight." "You don't have to do this, Frank." "I know I don't," Frank said, "but you paid me every dollar you owed the second you had it, when plenty of men in your position would have disappeared instead. Figured I owed you an evening." He hefted a stack of 2x4s onto his shoulder and headed toward Pete's crew without waiting for a response. Ethan's phone rang again near midnight, and this time it was Rosalind, her voice tighter than he'd heard it before. "I need you to know something before tomorrow," she said. "I made some calls about the inspector assigned to your file, Harold Fenn. He's ruled in favor of 2 other Harrington developments in the past 4 years, both times on properties where the violations were, generously speaking, debatable." Ethan felt his stomach tighten. "You're telling me the inspector's bought?" "I'm telling you I can't prove that in a courtroom, but I'd bet my license on it privately," Rosalind said. "Which means it won't matter how clean your wiring is if he's already decided what his report is going to say before he walks through that door. Your only real defense is making the work so undeniably thorough, so completely by the book documented 6 ways from Sunday, that even a man who wants to fail, you can't find anything real to hang it on." "Pete's documenting everything," Ethan said. "Photos, timestamps, cross-referenced against code." "Good," Rosalind said, "because if Fenn tries to manufacture a violation that isn't there, That documentation is the only thing standing between you and losing everything Samuel built. Get some sleep if you can, Mr. Walker. Tomorrow's going to test every bit of what you've put together." By the second evening, word had clearly begun to spread through town, in the particular way small towns spread things, because more people started showing up than Ethan had called a retired electrician who'd heard about it from Pete. Two young men Duke vouched for, who needed the work experience, an older woman who simply appeared with a folding table and began serving coffee and sandwiches to the crew without anyone asking her to. "Word travels," Duca said, watching the growing crowd with something like satisfaction. "This town's been waiting a long time for somebody to stand up to Harrington. Guess they finally found their guy." Ethan didn't feel like anybody's guy. He felt like a man barely holding together a structure that could collapse in a dozen different ways before the 4 days ran out. But watching strangers show up to rebuild a shop they had no personal stake in, simply because word had spread that something good was happening on Miller Street, he understood for the first time the actual shape of what Samuel Whitmore had spent a lifetime building. Not a business, not even a mission exactly, but a kind of quiet gravity that pulled good people toward each other when it mattered most. Among the small crowd gathering near the folding table, Ethan spotted a familiar face, the elderly woman from the auction house, the one who'd touched his sleeve and warned him that buildings like that didn't stay quiet forever. She made her way over, slowly leaning on a cane he hadn't noticed before. "You found out what I meant, didn't you?" she said, studying his tired face with something like satisfaction. "I did," Ethan admitted. "Wish you'd told me more at the time." "Wasn't mine to tell," she said simply. "Samuel kept his own counsel his whole life. But I watched this town nearly lose that man's legacy to men like Harrington once before, when they tried to have him declared unfit. And I promised myself if I ever saw somebody try that again, I wouldn't just stand by and watch." She glanced at the crew swarming through the shop, at the lights burning in windows that had been dark for 14 years. "Looks like I won't have to do much standing by after all." She patted his arm once gently and moved off to help the older woman at the coffee table. And Ethan stood there a moment longer, struck by how many quiet threads of this town had apparently been waiting invisibly for exactly this moment. The third night brought a different kind of trouble. Around 11, as the crew worked through the final structural repairs, a car pulled up outside that Ethan didn't recognize. Not Weller's sedan, something smaller, older, driven carefully. A woman climbed out, hesitating near the door, looking at the activity inside like she wasn't sure she belonged. Ethan stepped out to meet her. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for whoever's running this," the woman said. "Somebody left 3 messages on an old number of mine. Said something about Samuel Whitmore." Ethan's breath caught. "Diane Carter." Her eyes widened slightly. "How do you know that name?" "Because I've been trying to find you for 2 days, Ethan said. "There's a wall inside with your picture on it. Rebuilt, same as Marcus Reed's, same as Calvin Brooks's. Samuel helped you once. I'm trying to finish what he started, and I don't have much time left to do it." Diane's composure cracked slightly, something old and painful flickering across her face. "I made a mistake a long time ago that cost me every job I've had since," she said quietly. "Nobody in this business trusts a woman who's been through what I went through. Samuel was the only one who ever gave me a real chance." "I'm not asking you to erase whatever happened," Ethan said. "I'm asking if you want another chance from somebody who already knows part of your story and doesn't care what the rest of it looks like." Diane stood there a long moment, torn between old caution and something clearly desperate to believe him, and then slowly she nodded. "Show me where you need me," she said, echoing the exact words Calvin had used 2 nights earlier, and walked through the door into the noise and dust, an unfinished promise of a shop that was piece by piece becoming exactly what a dead man had always intended it to be. Near 2 in the morning, exhaustion finally forced a break, and the crew gathered around the folding table the older woman had set up, passing around sandwiches and lukewarm coffee, in a silence that felt less like fatigue and more like something settling into place. Marcus sat beside Calvin, both men still covered in drywall dust, and Diane took the seat across from them, still visibly unsure whether she belonged. "You were the one on the wall," Calvin said to her, studying her face in the dim light. "Rebuilt same as me." "Same as you," Diane said quietly. "How'd he find you?" Marcus asked. "I fixed his truck once, years back, wouldn't take you his money." Diane said, a small, surprised laugh escaping her. Guess that was apparently a pattern with him. Finding people who wouldn't take money for doing the right thing, then making sure they never had to want for anything again. Calvin raised his paper cup slightly, an unspoken toast, and Marcus and Diane both lifted theirs to meet it, and Ethan, watching from a few feet away, with Duke beside him, felt something settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the deadline pressing down on all of them. "Look at that," Duke murmured. "Man's been dead 6 years and he's still building family out of strangers." "That's not him," Ethan said quietly. "That's what he taught the rest of us to do without him." The second night brought its own scare. Around 3 in the morning, one of Duke's younger crew members reached into a junction box Pete had marked as still live, distracted, and running on too little sleep, and a sharp crack and a shower of sparks sent him stumbling backward with a shout that stopped every heart in the building for a full second. I'm fine," the young man said quickly, shaking out his hand, more startled than hurt. But Marcus was already there, gripping his wrist, checking for burns, with the practiced calm of a man who'd seen worse. "You're fine," Marcus confirmed, exhaling. "But that's your only mistake tonight. Everybody tag out live circuits before you touch them. No exceptions. I don't care how tired you are." He looked around at the crew, his voice carrying an authority nobody argued with. "We don't finish this building by rushing into somebody getting hurt. Slow enough to be safe, fast enough to make the deadline. That's the only speed we're working at from here on." Ethan found himself standing outside a few minutes later, needing air, his hands still unsteady from the adrenaline of watching sparks fly 2 feet from a man's face. Duke found him there, leaning against the truck, staring up at a sky gone gray with the coming dawn. "You doing okay?" Duke asked. "I keep thinking about how many ways this could still fall apart," Ethan admitted. "Somebody gets hurt. The inspector's bought. Harrington finds some other angle we haven't thought of yet. I got all these people risking their time, their sleep, their safety for a building that might get condemned in 3 days anyway." "Maybe," Duke said. "Or maybe it doesn't get condemned, and 5 years from now, there's 100 people who came through those doors and got the same thing Marcus and Calvin and Diane got." He nudged Ethan's shoulder. "Either way, you know what you'd have done if you hadn't tried." "What's that nothing?" Duke said simply. "And nothing's never once looked good on you." Ethan let out a tired laugh, the first real one in 3 days, and pushed himself off the truck. "Back to work," he said, and Duke followed him back inside. By the final morning with the inspection only hours away, Pete Sorensen walked the length of the shop with his clipboard checking box after box against county code, his expression unreadable until he reached the last page and looked up at the exhausted, filthy, hopeful faces gathered around him. "It's not perfect," Pete said slowly, "but it's legal. Every wire, every panel, every fire exit. I'd stake my old badge on it." He flipped back through his notebook, reading off the list like a man reciting something he was proud of. Full electrical rewire up to current code. New fire door on the east exit panic bar installed and tested. Load-bearing beams sistered and reinforced photographed before and after. Smoke detectors in every room, hardwired battery backup. Every permit filed and stamped this morning before the county office even opened. He paused, and something almost like a smile broke through his exhaustion. "Whoever's coming to inspect this place better bring more than a clipboard, because I don't think they're going to find what they're hoping to find." A ragged cheer went up through the crew, exhausted laughter and relief cutting through 3 days of grinding effort, and for one brief moment, standing in the middle of the shop he'd bought for $12.30, surrounded by people who'd been strangers 72 hours earlier, Ethan let himself believe they might actually win this. That was when his phone rang, an unfamiliar number, and something in the ordinary sound of it made every hair on his arms rise before he'd even answered. "Mr. Walker," a clipped unfamiliar voice said. "This is Harold Fenn County Building Inspector. I'm calling to confirm tomorrow morning's inspection has been moved up." Ethan's stomach dropped through the floor. "Moved up to when?" "1 hour, Fenn said. I'll be there in 1 hour, Mr. Walker. I trust that won't be a problem." The line went dead, and Ethan stood frozen in the middle of a shop full of exhausted people who had no idea the ground had just shifted beneath them. One final time staring at the phone in his hand, understanding with a sick certainty that Harrington's reach clearly extended further into that county office than anyone had been willing to admit. "Ethan," Duke's voice cut through the fog, worried now, catching the change in his face. "What is it?" Ethan looked around at all of them. Marcus wiping grease from his hands, Calvin standing protectively near Samuel's restored panhead, Diane coiling extension cords with steady practice movements, Frank leaning on a stack of lumber he'd helped haul in, Himself Pete's clipboard, still open to a page full of careful, honest documentation. 72 hours of strangers becoming something that felt impossibly like family, and all of it about to be tested in a way none of them had been given time to prepare for. "Inspector's coming," Ethan said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Not tomorrow morning." He checked his watch. 58 minutes from now. 58 minutes. The number hit the crew like a physical blow, and for one frozen second, nobody moved at all. Then Pete Sorensen's voice cut through the silence, sharp and commanding in a way nobody had heard from him yet. "Nobody panic. Panic makes mistakes, and we don't have time for mistakes." He was already flipping through his notebook, calling out assignments. "Marcus, final check on every panel, make sure nothing's still open. Diane, get those extension cords coiled and out of walking paths. Fire code's going to look at egress first thing. Calvin, that back exit needs a final sweep, nothing blocking it, nothing loose." The shop exploded back into motion. Exhaustion burned away by pure adrenaline, and Ethan found himself dialing Rosalind with hands that had gone cold despite the frantic heat of the room. "He moved it up," Ethan said the second she answered. 50-something minutes now, says he's coming himself." "That's not procedure," Rosalind said instantly, her voice sharpening. "Inspectors don't get to unilaterally accelerate a scheduled visit without written notice. I'm coming down there myself. Don't let him inside without me present. Do you understand? Stall, if you have to." "How am I supposed to stall a county inspector?" "Offer him coffee," Rosalind said dryly. "I'm 11 minutes away." She hung up, and Ethan turned back to the shop floor to find Duke already directing two of his crew to sweep the last of the construction debris into neat, contained piles, the whole space transforming in real time from a chaotic worksite into something that might, if the light hit it right, actually look finished. 20 minutes till we look presentable," Duke said, wiping sweat from his forehead. 40 till showtime. We can make it." "We have to make it," Ethan said. The elderly woman from the coffee table appeared suddenly at his elbow, pressing something into his hand, a folded newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. "Thought you might want this before he gets here," she said. "Found it going through some old boxes last week. Samuel, 20 years back, being honored by the county for public service. Might remind whoever's coming through that door exactly whose legacy they're standing in." Ethan looked down at the clipping. A grainy photograph of a younger Samuel Whitmore shaking hands with a county official, and felt something steady settle into his chest even as the clock kept bleeding away. "Thank you," he said quietly, tucking it into his jacket pocket. Calvin appeared beside him a moment later, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had seen better days, his own nerves plainly visible, despite the calm he was clearly working to project. "You good?" he asked. "Not even a little," Ethan admitted. "Me neither," Calvin said, managing a tired half-smile. "But Samuel used to say the shakiest hands still turn the wrench long as you don't stop moving them. Figured that applies here too." He clapped Ethan once on the shoulder and went back to his final sweep of the training bay, and Ethan found something in the small, gruff kindness of it that steadied him more than he expected. Rosalind's car pulled up with 9 minutes to spare, and she strode through the door in a sharp gray suit that looked entirely out of place among the sawdust and exhausted faces, a leather folder clutched under one arm. "Talk to me," she said, scanning the crop with quick, assessing eyes. "What's finished? What isn't?" "Everything on Pete's list is finished," Ethan said. "Wiring, fire door, the beam smoke detectors permits." "Good." Rosalind's gaze landed on the photograph wall, the tarped motorcycles, the general state of controlled chaos being wrestled into order. "Then here's what happens when Fenn walks through that door. You say nothing unless I tell you to. I do the talking. If he finds anything, and I mean anything that isn't a genuine documented violation, I want it on record immediately in front of witnesses. Understood?" "Understood." A car door slammed outside, crisp and deliberate, and every head in the shop turned toward the front window at once. Harold Fenn walked in wearing a county polo shirt and an expression of practiced neutrality that didn't quite mask the faint, unmistakable satisfaction underneath it, a man expecting an easy win. He stopped just inside the door, clipboard already out, eyes sweeping the room with the clinical detachment of someone who had already decided what his report would say. "Mr. Walker," Fenn said, "I wasn't expecting quite this large an audience. These are the people who did the work, Mr. Fenn," Rosalind said smoothly, stepping forward before Ethan could respond. "Rosalind Pike, counsel for the trustee. I'll be observing today's inspection." Something flickered across Fenn's face, brief, quickly smoothed over. That's not standard procedure, but I don't see a rule against it. Let's begin, shall we? He moved through the shop with slow, deliberate steps, clipboard scratching, pausing at the electrical panel first. Marcus stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching every movement like a hawk. Panel's been replaced. Fenn observed more to himself than anyone else. Fully up to current code, Marcus said. Licensed electrician's stamp is right there on the permit filed and approved this morning. Fenn glanced at the paperwork, made a note, and then looked up at Ethan with something almost like suspicion. Rush permits like this, licensed contractors, materials all in 4 days. That's not cheap, Mr. Walker. Mind telling me where the funding came from? A trust established by the previous owner, Ethan said carefully, glancing once at Rosalind, who gave the faintest nod of permission. Documented, dispersed, and recorded with proper authorization. My attorney has copies if the county requires them. I'll want copies, Fenn said, making another note, and Ethan couldn't tell whether the request was procedural or an attempt to find some new thread to pull at. Already prepared, Rosalind said smoothly, producing a folder from her leather case without missing a beat, as though she'd anticipated the question before Fenn had finished asking it. Every disbursement, every receipt, every dollar accounted for. Fenn took the folder, flipped through it with visibly less enthusiasm than he'd shown moments earlier, and moved on toward the back exit without further comment. At the back exit, Fenn tested the panic bar twice, checked the door. Swing ran his fingers along the frame like he was searching for something specific. A new installation, he said. Correct, Pete said, stepping forward with his own notebook. Installed and inspected yesterday afternoon. Here's the manufacturer's certification, the installer's license number, and photographs time-stamped before and after. Fenn took the notebook, flipped through it slower than necessary, his expression giving away nothing. Very thorough, he said finally in a tone that could have meant anything. He moved to the reinforced support beam next, and this was the moment Ethan's chest tightened hardest, remembering how close that repair had come to unraveling everything 3 nights earlier. Fenn pressed his palm against the wood, then produced a small tool from his kit and drilled a shallow test hole directly into the beam. The room went utterly silent. Fenn examined the tool, checked it against something on his clipboard, and Ethan realized he was holding his breath. Solid, Fenn said almost begrudgingly. Good work. A ripple of quiet relief moved through the crew, but Fenn wasn't finished. He moved toward the basement stairwell, next to the hidden door behind the tool room, shelving still slightly ajar from days of coming and going, and Ethan felt every muscle in his body go tense. What's down there? Fenn asked. Storage, Ethan said carefully. Old files. Fenn descended without waiting for permission, and Ethan followed close behind, painfully aware of the map on the wall, the photographs, everything that made this building so much more than a repair shop, hoping none of it would somehow become a liability in a county inspector's hands. Fenn's flashlight swept across the filing cabinets, the long table, the map with its scattered red pins, and he stood there a long moment, studying it with an expression Ethan couldn't read at all. This your handiwork? Fenn asked. Samuel Whitmore's, Ethan said. I just found it. Fenn's eyes moved across the map, slowly reading names, and something in his posture shifted, not softening exactly, but changing some private calculation, working behind his eyes that Ethan couldn't follow. His flashlight paused near the bottom corner of the map, lingering there a beat longer than anywhere else, and Ethan watched something unreadable pass across the man's face before he clicked the light away. My uncle used to bring his truck here, Fenn said abruptly, not quite looking at Ethan. Years back. Whitmore fixed the transmission for free when my uncle couldn't afford the parts. Never told anybody that story. Didn't seem relevant to my job. He straightened his voice, returning to its clipped official register as though the moment hadn't happened at all. We should finish upstairs. He said nothing more, simply turned and climbed back up the stairs, and Ethan trailed after him with his heart hammering, unable to guess whether that small, unexpected confession had been a good sign or a terrible one. Back on the main floor, Fenn stood in the center of the shop for a long moment, clipboard held loosely at his side, and the entire crew seemed to hold its breath, collectively waiting. There's a structural notation I need to verify against the original complaint filing, Fenn said finally, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. The complaint specifically referenced insufficient fire egress on the east side. I count one exit here plus the front door. Code for a space this size given intended occupancy typically requires a third point of egress if you're planning public use. The room went cold. We're not licensed for public occupancy yet, Rosalind said quickly. This inspection is for basic structural and electrical safety, not a change of use permit, which comes later in the process. With respect, Miss Pike, Fenn said, and something in the false politeness of it made Ethan's stomach drop. The original complaint specifically alleges intended public use based on activity observed at this property over the past several days. Large gatherings, community involvement, exactly the kind of use that would trigger occupancy requirements this building doesn't currently meet. Ethan felt the trap close around him with sickening clarity. Every neighbor who'd shown up with coffee, every volunteer who'd walked through that door to help, every piece of evidence that this place was becoming exactly what Samuel intended, Fenn was twisting it into the very violation that could shut them down. That's not occupancy, that's a construction crew, Duke said sharply, stepping forward despite Rosalind's warning glance. You want to cite a man for having help fixing his own building? I want to follow the complaint as filed, Fenn said coolly, making a note on his clipboard. And as filed, this building shows clear signs of intended public assembly use without the corresponding permits or egress requirements. I'm sorry, Mr. Walker. That's a significant finding. Rosalind's jaw tightened, but before she could respond, the shop's front door opened again, and every head turned toward it. A woman Ethan didn't recognize walked in mid-40s, sharp-eyed, a press badge clipped to her jacket, and a small camera slung over one shoulder. Sorry to interrupt, she said, glancing around at the tense tableau with obvious professional interest. Sandra Kessler, Missoula Tribune. I've been covering the Miller Street development story for the past 2 years. Heard through some sources that a county inspector moved up a scheduled visit by nearly 2 weeks with less than an hour's notice, right after the property owner refused a substantial buyout offer from Victor Harrington's development group. That's an interesting sequence of events. Mind if I ask a few questions? Fenn's composed expression cracked for just a fraction of a second before he smoothed it back into place. This is a routine county inspection, ma'am. Nothing newsworthy about it. Funny, Sandra said, pulling out a small notebook of her own, because I've got public records showing you have ruled favorably on 2 other Harrington properties in the past 4 years, well, both times under similarly accelerated timelines. That's not an accusation, Mr. Fenn. Just an observation I'd love your comment on the record. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Ethan had heard in days. I have nothing to comment on, Fenn said stiffly. This inspection will proceed according to the findings as documented. Of course, Sandra said pleasantly, raising her camera slightly. Mind if I photograph the space while you finish up public record and all? Fenn's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around his clipboard, and Ethan watched something shift behind the man's eyes. The calculation of a man suddenly recalculating the cost of a decision he'd already half made. The egress issue, Rosalind said, seizing the moment with the precision of a woman who'd spent decades reading rooms exactly like this one, applies specifically to permitted public occupancy, Mr. Fenn, which this property does not currently hold and is not seeking today. Today's inspection, per the original notice, concerns structural and electrical safety only. I'd be happy to review the relevant county code section with you right now on the record in front of Ms. Kessler, if that would help clarify the scope. Fenn stood very still for a long moment, clearly running calculations. Ethan could only partially guess at the newspaper reporter, with her camera raised, the crew watching in tense silence the documentation Pete had assembled, sitting in a neat damning stack on the workbench, and whatever private arrangement had brought him here an hour early in the first place suddenly looking a great deal riskier than it had that morning. The structural and electrical findings, Fenn said, finally, his voice tight, are satisfactory, fully compliant. He made a final note, tore a carbon copy from his clipboard, and held it out toward Ethan without quite meeting his eyes. The occupancy question will need to be addressed separately through the standard permitting process before any public use of the space. Understood, Rosalind said smoothly, taking the paper before Ethan's shaking hands could fumble it. Thank you for your thoroughness, Mr. Fenn. Fenn left without another word, moving quickly toward his car, and Sandra Kessler watched him go, with the faint, satisfied expression of a woman who'd just watched a story confirm itself in real time. The shop held its silence for 3 full seconds after the door closed behind him. Then it broke completely. The cheer that went up was louder than anything that had come before it, exhausted bodies collapsing into hugs and backslaps, Calvin openly wiping his eyes, Diane laughing in a way that sounded like it hadn't happened in years, Duke lifting Ethan clean off his feet in a hug that crushed the air from his lungs. "You did it?" Duke said, setting him back down, grinning wide enough to crack his whole tired face open. $12.30, and you just beat Victor Harrington's own hand-picked inspector. "We did it," Ethan corrected, looking around at every exhausted, filthy, triumphant face in that room. "All of us." Duke's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he glanced at it, his expression shifting into something more serious. "That's Gareth," he said quietly, and the name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Ethan's stomach tightened instantly at the sound of it, the same man who'd stood in the center of a smoke-filled clubhouse 11 years earlier and ended everything with a 4-minute vote. "What does he want?" Ethan asked, careful to keep his voice even. "Says words traveled fast," Duke said, reading the message. "Says he heard what happened here today and what's been happening the last few weeks, and he wants to know if he can come by. Says he's got something he wants to say to you in person if you'll let him." Ethan felt 11 years of carefully managed distance rise up all at once. Old anger and older hurt, tangled together in a knot he wasn't sure he wanted to untie in front of an audience. "Tell him I'll think about it," he said finally, which was as much honesty as he could manage in that moment. Duke nodded understanding, written plainly across his face, and didn't push typing out a reply and pocketing the phone without another word on the subject. Whatever came of that message would come later on Ethan's own terms, and for now, standing in a shop full of people who'd chosen him without hesitation, that felt like enough. Sandra Kessler approached him a moment later, notebook still open. "Mr. Walker, I'd love to get your story properly if you're willing. $12 auction secret, trust dead mechanics, hidden mission. That's not just a local piece anymore. That's something people are going to want to read." Ethan hesitated. Old instincts warning him against visibility, against putting his name and his history into print, where anyone, including Harrington, could pick it apart. But something Samuel had written kept surfacing in his mind. The world's full of people who'll tell you exactly what you did wrong. "Give me a few days," Ethan said. "There's more to this story than what happened here today, and I want to tell it right when I do." Sandra nodded, handing him a card. "Whenever you're ready. And Mr. Walker, for what it's worth, whatever you're building here, this town needed it. You could see that on every face in this room today." She left, and the crowd slowly began to thin, exhaustion finally catching up with the adrenaline now that the immediate danger had passed. Rosalind stayed behind, watching the room empty with a thoughtful, unreadable expression. "That reporter didn't show up by accident," Ethan said once most of the crew had gone. "Who called her?" Rosalind's mouth curved into the faintest, most satisfied smile he'd seen from her yet. "I've known Sandra Kessler for 11 years. She's been trying to get someone to go on record about Harrington's development practices since before you ever walked into that auction house. When I saw that inspection notice moved up without proper procedure, I made exactly one phone call." She closed her leather folder with a soft, final click. "Samuel taught me a long time ago that sunlight is sometimes a better weapon than any motion I could file in court." Ethan sat down heavily on an overturned crate, the adrenaline finally draining out of him all at once, leaving something hollow and shaking in its place. "How many more of these fights are coming, Rosalind? Honestly?" Her expression sobered. "Honestly, I don't know. Harrington spent 2 years and considerable money on this block. Men like that don't walk away from a losing position gracefully. Today you won a battle. I'd be lying if I told you the war was over. Then what do we do?" "You finished building what Samuel started," Rosalind said. "Fast, publicly, undeniably good, so that every future attack Harrington launches looks exactly as ugly and self-serving as it actually is. The best defense you have left, Mr. Walker, isn't a lawyer. It's the truth visible enough that nobody in this county can pretend not to see it." She left shortly after, and Ethan spent the rest of that afternoon alone in the shop, walking slowly through rooms that 3 days earlier had been a sealed, silent monument to a dead man's secret and were now scarred with sawdust and fresh paint and the visible evidence of people who had chosen without hesitation to show up for a stranger. Over the following weeks, the pace didn't slow so much as it changed shape. Where the first 4 days had been a desperate sprint against a deadline, what followed became something steadier. More deliberate, permits filed properly for public occupancy, a small classroom space built into what had once been unused storage, a signed commission for the front of the building that read simply, Whitmore's Second Chance Garage, beneath a smaller line Ethan had insisted on personally. Founded on a debt that could never be repaid, only passed forward, Calvin became the shop's first full-time instructor, teaching basic engine repair to two young men. Duke's crew had vouched for men fresh out of situations not unlike the one Calvin himself had once climbed out of. Diane took over the electrical training, her steady hands and patient voice turning what had once been her greatest professional liability into the things students respected about her most. Marcus split his time between his three shops in Bozeman and Miller Street, unable, he admitted with a rueful laugh, to stay away for long once he'd seen what was actually being built. One of the first students to walk through the door was a 17-year-old girl named Ruthie Alvarez, whose mother worked two jobs and whose father hadn't been in the picture in years, and who showed up the first week not because she wanted to learn engines, but because the after-school program that used to keep her occupied had lost its funding and she had nowhere else to be. Calvin took one look at the sharp, guarded way. She watched everyone in the room and recognized something in it he didn't need explained. "You don't have to want to be here," he told her the first afternoon, sliding a disassembled carburetor across the workbench toward her. "Just be curious for 20 minutes. See what happens." 6 weeks later, Ruthie was the fastest hands in the beginner class, and Diane had started quietly setting aside advanced manuals for her without being asked, and Ethan found himself standing in the doorway one evening, watching her explain compression ratios to a boy twice her size with the patient authority of someone who'd been doing it for years instead of weeks. "Never thought I'd end up back here," Marcus said one evening, watching a nervous 19-year-old successfully complete his first solo carburetor rebuild, the kid's face lighting up with the exact same disbelieving pride Marcus's own photograph on the wall had captured 18 years earlier. Guess some circles just take longer to close than others. Frank stopped by most weeks, no longer just a landlord, but something closer to an unofficial advisor, helping Ethan navigate permits and paperwork with the patient practicality of a man who'd spent decades understanding how small-town bureaucracy actually worked. Even the elderly woman from the auction house, whose name Ethan finally learned was Margaret Voss, a detail that made him go very still for a long moment, wondering before deciding not to ask whether she'd once been married to the very man who'd voted him out of his club 11 years earlier, became a fixture at the coffee table, greeting every nervous new arrival with the same steady warmth she'd once offered Ethan in that auction hall. Sandra Kessler's article ran 3 weeks after the inspection, a long, carefully reported piece that laid out the full story: the auction, the trust, Harrington's history of aggressive acquisition tactics, and the quiet decades-long generosity of a mechanic nobody in town had ever fully understood while he was alive. The piece did not name Callie Reyes at Ethan's specific and firm request, but it did not shy away from the vote that had cost him his club, framing it plainly as the origin of everything that followed. The response surprised him more than anything else that entire month. Strangers began showing up at the shop simply to see it, to donate tools or money or time, to tell him quietly that they'd known Samuel Whitmore in some small way and never understood until now the full shape of what he'd been doing all along. Duke's own chapter, several of whom had voted against Ethan 11 years earlier, sent an anonymous donation large enough to fund a full semester of tools and materials, with no note attached except a single line: "Some debts take longer to pay than others." A handwritten letter arrived at the shop nearly 2 weeks after the article ran no return address. The envelope simply marked Ethan Walker in careful, unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a single page unsigned that read, "Only I read what you wrote about kindness costing you everything. Mine cost me a job I loved and a family who stopped speaking to me. Reading about your shop is the first time in 3 years I've thought maybe it was worth it anyway. Thank you for building something that let a stranger believe that." Ethan read it twice, folded it carefully, and pinned it to the corner of the photograph wall beside all the others where it stayed. Ethan didn't know what to do with any of it exactly except keep working. It was on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, 6 weeks after the inspection, with the shop finally settling into something like a rhythm, that the black sedan returned. Ethan was in the office reviewing enrollment paperwork for the next cohort of students when he heard it pull up outside not Weller's careful, unhurried parking job, but something sharper, more deliberate, a car driven by someone used to being watched rather than doing the watching. He stepped out onto the shop floor to find a man he'd never seen before standing just inside the front door, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, studying the space with the calm, assessing patience of someone who had waited a very long time to see it in person. "Mr. Walker," the man said, his voice smooth and unhurried, carrying the particular weight of someone who rarely needed to raise it to be obeyed. My name is Victor Harrington. I believe it's well past time we finally spoke face to face. Ethan set down the paperwork in his hand, slowly buying himself a second to steady his voice before he answered. Mr. Weller usually does your talking for you. Mr. Weller handles negotiations, Harrington said, stepping further into the shop, his eyes moving across the space with an attention that felt almost clinical. The fresh wiring the training bay Calvin had set up in the back corner, the photograph wall he paused in front of for a long moment before continuing. This isn't a negotiation anymore. I lost that particular fight 3 weeks ago when your inspector turned out to have a conscience buried somewhere under my money after all. A faint, humorless smile. I don't enjoy losing, Mr. Walker, but I do respect it when it happens cleanly. Then why are you here? Harrington turned to face him fully, and something in his expression shifted, the polished calm cracking just slightly to reveal something older, more complicated underneath. Because I knew Samuel Whitmore for 31 years, he said, long before either of us had any money worth fighting over. Ethan went very still. You knew him personally? We grew up 2 streets apart, Harrington said. I used to spend afternoons in that shop before it was even a business, watching his father teach him how to rebuild an engine from nothing. Samuel was the only friend I had who didn't care that my family had money and his didn't. That mattered to me once more than you'd probably believe looking at me now. What happened? Life happened, Harrington said, something bitter threading through the words. I left for business school. He stayed. I came back 20 years later with capital and ambition and a very different idea of what this town could become, and he looked at everything I'd built and told me to my face that I'd traded my soul for square footage. A muscle worked in his jaw. I offered him more money than anyone in this county had ever seen for that property twice, and both times he turned it down like I was insulting him by asking. So you tried to have him declared incompetent, Ethan said flatly. Harrington's eyes flicked to him sharply. Rosalind Pike's been thorough. Was it true? A long silence stretched between them, and for the first time since he'd walked through the door, Harrington looked less like a developer and more like a tired old man carrying something heavy he'd never once set down. I told myself it was business, he said quietly. I've spent 6 years telling myself that. But if I'm honest with you, Mr. Walker, in a way I haven't been honest with anyone in a very long time. I think some part of me simply couldn't stand watching him choose that shop over everything I thought success was supposed to look like. I think I wanted him to admit he'd been wrong about me, and when he wouldn't, I tried to take away the thing that let him keep being right. Ethan didn't know what to say to that. The raw honesty of it sat strangely alongside everything Weller had threatened, everything the bribed inspector had nearly cost them. He beat me in court, Harrington continued, spent nearly everything he had doing it, and I told myself that was the end of it, that I'd let an old friendship die with a little dignity intact. Then he died anyway 6 years later, and instead of feeling any relief, I felt exactly like what I was. A man who'd spent his oldest friendship trying to win an argument that was never actually about the money. So this whole thing, Ethan said slowly, understanding arriving in pieces. The buyout offers Weller the inspector that was never really about $11 million in tax revenue, was it? The development is real, Harrington said. The jobs are real. I'm not going to stand here and pretend I manufactured an entire project out of spite. But I won't insult you by claiming this particular parcel was purely business either. Some part of me wanted this property because taking it felt like finally winning an argument Samuel never let me finish while he was alive. He looked around the shop again, slower this time, taking in the training bay, the fresh paint, the sign out front he must have already seen on his way in. And now I've lost that argument twice. Once to a dead man in a courtroom, and once to whatever you've built here in 6 weeks. That 31 years of friendship never let me understand about him. What do you want from me, Mr. Harrington? Harrington was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally answered, something in his voice had changed, less performance, more exhaustion. I came here to tell you the development moves forward on the rest of the block regardless. That part isn't negotiable, and I won't pretend otherwise to make this conversation more comfortable for either of us. But this parcel, he gestured at the shop around them, at the photograph wall, at everything Samuel had quietly built, and Ethan had fought to save. I'm formally withdrawing my interest in acquiring it, effective today. My attorneys will file the necessary paperwork, releasing any remaining claims by the end of the week. Ethan stared at him, waiting for the catch, unable to quite believe the offer wasn't hiding some deeper trap. Why? Because I'm 68 years old, Harrington said simply, and I've spent 6 years losing an argument to a ghost, and I find standing here that I'm finally tired of losing it. He straightened his jacket, the moment of raw exposure folding itself carefully back beneath the polished exterior he'd walked in wearing. Harold Fenn will not be inspecting anything in this county again, incidentally. That situation is being handled quietly through channels that don't require your involvement. That's convenient, Ethan said, some old wariness refusing to fully unclench. It's damage control, Harrington corrected, almost amused. I'm not a changed man, Mr. Walker, whatever this conversation might suggest. I'm a man who recognizes a losing position when the alternative is watching a newspaper reporter turn my company into a cautionary tale about corruption for the next decade. Don't mistake practicality for redemption. What about the eminent domain clause, Ethan pressed? The safety hazard provision. Rosalind said that was your real angle from the start. It was, Harrington admitted without hesitation or apology. And it would still work in theory if you ever let that building slide back into disrepair. But you won't, will you? It wasn't really a question. That clause only threatens buildings people have given up on, Mr. Walker. You've made it very publicly clear you haven't given up on this one. I have neither the appetite nor, frankly, the public standing left to pursue it further. He moved toward the door, then paused, looking back at the shop one final time, his gaze lingering longest on the tarped panhead. He's sitting exactly where Samuel had always kept it. He'd have liked what you did here, Harrington said, quiet enough that Ethan almost missed it. Faster than he'd have liked it took an inspector's bribe and a newspaper article to get there, probably. But he'd have liked it. He walked out without waiting for a response, and a moment later the sedan pulled away from the curb for what Ethan suspected, though couldn't yet be certain, might be the final time. Ethan stood alone in the shop for a long time after the engine noise faded, turning Harrington's words over in his mind, trying to reconcile the calculating man who'd sent Weller to threaten him with a tired old friend who just walked away from a fight he could have easily kept fighting. Samuel's letter had warned him about people trying to take what was inside that safe before the right person got the chance to find it. It had never once mentioned that the man leading that fight might, underneath everything, simply be grieving. He locked up the shop that evening later than usual, standing on the sidewalk where he'd once stood staring at an orange notice with 4 days on the clock, and looked up at the sign Duke's crew had helped him hang 2 weeks earlier, Whitmore's Second Chance Garage glowing faintly under the streetlight, the smaller line beneath it catching the last of the evening sun. Founded on a debt that could never be repaid, only passed forward. His phone buzzed as he reached his truck. A text from Rosalind, brief and characteristically direct. Just got off the phone with Harrington's counsel. Confirmed he's withdrawing all claims. Whatever you said to him, Mr. Walker, or whatever he finally said to you, it worked. Get some rest. You've earned 1 full night of it. He called Duke on the drive home, unable to hold the news in for the length of the ride. Harrington came by himself, Ethan said the second Duke picked up. Withdrew everything. It's over, Duke. All of it. There was a stunned pause on the line, and then Duke let out a whoop loud enough that Ethan had to hold the phone away from his ear. You beat him, Duke said, disbelief and pride tangled together in his voice. $12.30, and you beat Victor Harrington clean. We beat him, Ethan corrected, the same words he'd used in the shop weeks earlier, and meant them just as fully now. I'm telling everybody, sus, Duke said. Tonight, whole chapter's going to hear about this before you even get home. Duke, Ethan hesitated, an old ache surfacing. Gareth's message. Tell him yes. Tell him he can come by. Duke was quiet for a moment. You sure? No, Ethan admitted. But I'm tired of being sure about everything before I do it. Samuel wasn't sure I'd ever walk into that auction house either. Worked out anyway. Ethan sat behind the wheel for a long moment before starting the engine, and for the first time since the auctioneer's gavel had come down on a building nobody wanted, he let himself believe cautiously that the hardest part might actually be behind him. Gareth Voss showed up 3 days later on a Sunday afternoon when the shop was quiet except for Calvin running a diagnostic check on a customer's engine in the back bay, and Ethan felt his whole body go rigid the moment he recognized the truck pulling up outside. Calvin appeared at his shoulder almost instantly, wiping his hands on a rag. his easy demeanor replaced by something sharper. That the man Duke mentioned, the one from the vote. That's him. You want me out there with you? Ethan considered it a moment-old instinct warring with something newer, steadier. No, he said finally, but thank you for asking. Calvin nodded, stepping back but staying close enough to the front window that Ethan understood he wasn't going far, and something about that quiet, unasked-for loyalty settled Ethan's nerves more than any words could have. He walked outside to meet him, rather than let Gareth come in. Some old instinct insisting this conversation shouldn't happen inside Samuel's own walls, not yet, not until he knew what kind of conversation it was going to be. Gareth climbed out slower than Ethan remembered him moving, 11 years having carved deep lines into a face that had once seemed unshakable, and for a long moment neither man said anything at all. You look good, Gareth said finally, which wasn't at all what Ethan had expected him to open with. You look older, Ethan said, and something in Gareth's face cracked into a brief, startled laugh. Fair enough. Gareth shifted his weight, hands jammed into his jacket pockets, a man clearly working up to something he had rehearsed and still couldn't quite deliver smoothly. I read the article twice. Then I read it a third time out loud to my wife because I wanted her to hear it the way I heard it, and I wanted to see if saying it out loud would make it feel any different. Did it? No, Gareth admitted. Made it worse, actually, hearing it in my own voice. He exhaled hard like the next words cost him something physical to produce. I ran that vote 11 years ago like justice was something simple. Like loyalty only pointed one direction. I told myself for over a decade that I'd done right by the club, kept things clean, kept the code intact. He shook his head slowly. Never once let myself think too hard about what happened to the girl. What almost happened to her, if you hadn't done something about it. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, old and complicated. You could have voted different. I could have. Gareth agreed, no defensiveness in it at all, just plain weathered honesty. I told myself the vote wasn't really about her. Told myself it was about you breaking ranks, about what happens to a club when a man decides his own judgment matters more than the group's. Easier to believe that than admit I was protecting a man who didn't deserve protecting. Because protecting him was simpler than admitting the whole system I'd built my identity around had a rot running through it I didn't want to look at. Why now? Ethan asked quietly. Why not 11 years ago, or 5 years ago, or last year? Because 11 years ago I was still telling myself I'd been right, Gareth said. And watching you build something like this out of nothing, watching this whole town rally around a man I helped cast out, that's not the kind of thing a man can keep explaining away forever, not if he's got any honesty left in him at all. He met Ethan's eyes directly for the first time since climbing out of the truck. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Ethan. I don't imagine that's mine to ask for. I just needed you to hear me say it out loud to your face after 11 years of not having the spine to do it. Ethan stood there a long moment, feeling something old and heavy shift inside him. Not quite releasing, not quite forgiving, but loosening all the same. The man you protected, Ethan said finally. Where's he now? Something dark passed across Gareth's face. Left the club 4 years back. Word is he's had trouble since. Different kind of trouble in a different town. He didn't elaborate further, and Ethan didn't ask him to. I don't need an apology to build what I'm building, Gareth, Ethan said. But I appreciate you finding the spine anyway. Gareth nodded slowly, something loosening in his own shoulders. Your shop, he said, glancing past Ethan toward the building, the fresh sign, the training bay visible through the front window. Word around the county is you're looking for instructors with electrical experience for an advanced class come spring. We are. I spent 30 years doing industrial electrical work before I retired, Gareth said. Wasn't fishing for the job, just saying it's there if you'd ever want it, and if you wouldn't, I understand completely. Ethan studied him for a long moment, weighing 11 years of hurt against the plain, unadorned honesty standing in front of him, and thought about everything Samuel's ledger had taught him about the particular kind of grace that didn't erase what came before, it only built something new on top of it. Come by Tuesday, Ethan said. We'll see how it goes. It wasn't forgiveness, not fully, not yet, but it was a door left open instead of closed, and for the first time in 11 years that felt like enough. The shop's occupancy permit came through 2 weeks later, and Ethan called every name in his growing circle to help plan what Frank insisted on calling a proper grand opening, though Ethan privately thought of it as something closer to an unveiling. The first time the full scope of what Samuel Whitmore had built and what they'd all built on top of it would be visible to the entire town at once. The morning of the opening, Ethan stood behind the front counter, reviewing his notes for the small speech he'd been dreading writing for a week when the bell above the door chimed, and he looked up to find a woman standing in the entrance he hadn't seen in 11 years. His breath caught entirely. Callie, he said, the name coming out rougher than he intended. She looked exactly like her photograph and nothing like the frightened 19-year-old he remembered, steadier now older, carrying herself with the quiet confidence of a woman who'd built an entire life out of the 20 minutes of safety he'd once bought her. "I read an article that didn't name me," she said, walking toward him slowly, "but described a vote and a highway and a woman that clearly wasn't supposed to identify closely enough that 3 separate people from my old life sent it to me within a week." A small disbelieving laugh escaped her. "Took me a while to work up the nerve to actually come find you." "How did you find me?" "The reporter," Callie said. "Oh, and Sandra Kessler. I called her, told her who I was, and she gave me your address after I convinced her I wasn't looking to make trouble." She stopped a few feet away, studying his face like she was trying to reconcile the man in front of her with the memory she'd carried for over a decade. "I've wanted to say thank you for 11 years, Ethan. Never had the words or the courage, or honestly for a long time, the ability to think about that night without falling apart." "You don't owe me anything," Ethan said, throat tight. "You never did." "I know I don't owe you," Callie said. "That's not why I'm here. I'm here because I run a youth center now. Because I help kids the way somebody once helped me, and I never had the chance to tell the person who made that possible what it actually meant." Her eyes were wet now, though her voice stayed steady. "You lost everything that night. Your club, your brothers, 11 years of the life you'd built. And you never once tried to find me, never asked anything back. Never let me carry the guilt of what it cost you." "I didn't want you carrying anything," Ethan said. "That was the whole point." "I know," Callie said. "And for years I let you have that. Let myself believe you just vanished into some biker myth and moved on clean. Took me a long time in therapy to understand that you carrying it alone wasn't actually protecting me. It was just moving the weight from my shoulders to yours, and I never got the chance to tell you I didn't need you to do that." She wiped at her eyes, laughing a little at herself. "I have 2 kids now, a husband who still doesn't know the whole story, just that something happened to me once and a stranger helped. I want to tell him properly someday. Well, wanted to see your face again, first make sure I remembered it right before I did." "Do you remember it right?" "Better than right," Callie said. "You looked terrified that night. I always assumed bikers weren't supposed to look terrified. Took me years to understand that was probably the bravest thing about it." Callie reached out and took his hand, brief and firm. "I'm carrying it anyway," she said. "Just not as a weight anymore. As something closer to the reason I get up every morning and do what I do." She glanced around the shop, taking in the training bay, the photograph wall visible through the office door, the sign out front she'd clearly already read on her way in. "Looks like you found a way to turn what happened into something bigger than either of us, too." Ethan didn't trust his voice enough to answer that directly, so he simply nodded, and Callie squeezed his hand once more before stepping back. "I'd like to stay for whatever's happening here today, if that's all right," she said. "Feels like the right place to finally close a very old chapter." "Stay as long as you want," Ethan said. "You more than earned a seat at this." By early afternoon, the shop was fuller than Ethan had ever seen it. Duke's entire chapter arriving in a loud, rumbling procession of motorcycles that drew half the neighborhood outside to watch Frank standing near the door, greeting people like an unofficial host. Margaret Voss holding court at her coffee table with a line of well-wishers. 3 deep, Rosalind arriving in a rare moment of visible relaxation, her usual sharp suit traded for something softer. Marcus had driven in from Bozeman with 2 of his own employees in tow, curious to see the place he'd helped save. Diane stood near her training station explaining wiring diagrams to a cluster of interested parents. Calvin gave an impromptu tour of Samuel's fully restored panhead to anyone who asked, his voice thick with pride, every time he told the story of the man who'd once propped a door open for a scared kid with nowhere else to be. Ethan watched Gareth cross the room toward the coffee table, and something in the way Margaret Voss's face changed the moment she saw him. Finally answered a question Ethan had been quietly carrying since the day he'd learned her last name. "Mom," Gareth said, bending to kiss her cheek, and Ethan felt the small revelation land with quiet, satisfying weight. Margaret Voss wasn't a stranger who'd simply taken an interest in Samuel's shop. She was Gareth's mother, and the warning she'd given Ethan at the auction house buildings like that, "Don't stay quiet forever," suddenly carried a far heavier meaning than he'd understood at the time. "You knew," Ethan said, approaching them both, "about the vote, about all of it. I knew my son helped end something he never forgave himself for." Margaret said, simply patting the seat beside her, until Gareth sat looking for the first time since Ethan had met him entirely, like a young man being scolded by his mother, rather than a former club president. "I watched him carry that for 11 years without the courage to fix it, and I promised myself if I ever saw a chance to nudge things back toward it right, I'd take it. Wasn't my place to say more than I did that day. But I could at least tell you the building was worth paying attention to." Gareth looked at his mother, something raw and grateful passing between them, and Ethan understood watching it that Margaret Voss's quiet presence at the coffee table every week hadn't been coincidence at all. It had been a mother slowly, patiently building the bridge her son hadn't known how to build himself. "Guess I owe you twice then," Ethan said to her. "You owe me nothing," Margaret said briskly, though her eyes were bright. "Just keep this place standing. That's payment enough for an old woman." Ruthie Alvarez, 17 and steady-handed, stood at the front of the training bay demonstrating a basic engine diagnostic to a small crowd of curious kids her own age, and Ethan watched her from across the room with something that felt uncomfortably close to a father's pride, though he'd never once used that word out loud. Sandra Kessler arrived with a photographer in tow, taking pictures for a follow-up piece she promised would run the following week, and pulled Ethan aside briefly. "You ready to tell me the rest of it?" she asked. "The part you asked me to wait on." Ethan glanced around the crowded shop at Callie standing quietly near the photograph wall at Duke's chapter, mingling easily with people who'd once been strangers at Gareth Voss, standing awkwardly near the back, clearly uncertain whether he belonged, but unwilling to leave. "Right that a man lost everything once for doing the right thing," Ethan said slowly, "and that 11 years later, everything he lost came back to him anyway, just wearing a different face. Right that the people who cast him out found their way back one at a time once they were finally ready to be honest about why. Right that forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It just makes room for something new to grow next to it." Sandra wrote it down word for word, her expression softening as she did. "That's a hell of a closing line, Mr. Walker." "Wasn't trying to write a closing line," Ethan said. "Just telling you the truth." Near the center of the crowd, Frank climbed onto an overturned crate and called for quiet, and the noise gradually settled into an expectant hush. "Most of you know the story by now," Frank said, his voice carrying easily across the packed shop floor. "A man walked into an auction house 11 months ago and paid $12.30 for a building everybody in this town had already given up on. Most of us laughed at him for it." A ripple of sheepish laughter moved through the crowd, several people glancing away. "I want to publicly admit I was one of the people who laughed hardest." More laughter, warmer this time, and Frank waited for it to settle before continuing. "But that man understood something the rest of us didn't," Frank said. "He understood that the things everybody else gives up on are sometimes exactly the things worth fighting for. He understood it because somebody taught him that lesson on a rainy highway 11 years ago, and he spent every day since paying it forward to anybody willing to walk through that door." He gestured toward Ethan standing near the counter with his throat too tight to speak. "Ethan Walker, get up here and say something, because frankly, this town's waited long enough to hear it from you directly." The crowd parted, slyly expectant faces turning toward him, and Ethan felt 11 years of silence and shame and quiet, stubborn hope all rising up at once as he made his way to the front of the room. He stood there a long moment, looking out at every face that had shown up for him, without hesitation. Duke Marcus, Calvin, Diane, Frank, Rosalind, Margaret Ruthie, Gareth standing uncertainly near the back, Callie near the photograph wall with her hand pressed lightly against her chest, and found for the first time and longer than he could remember that the words came easily. 11 months ago, Ethan said, I was a man nobody in this town expected anything from. 2 months behind on rent, estranged from the only family I'd ever really had known, mostly as the guy who used to ride with a real club before something happened nobody quite understood. He paused, letting that settle. What happened was I did the right thing once, and it cost me everything I thought mattered. Took me 11 years to understand that doing the right thing was never actually the mistake. The mistake was believing I had to carry the cost of it completely alone. He looked toward the photograph wall at the dozens of names Samuel had quietly rescued over 4 decades without ever once asking for recognition. A man named Samuel Whitmore spent his whole life proving something. Most of us forget the second things get hard that kindness isn't a weakness, and that the people everybody else gives up on are usually the people who understand best what it costs to be given a second chance. He built this place in secret for decades, and he died before I ever got the chance to properly thank him. So instead, I'm thanking him the only way I know how, by making sure nobody who walks through that door ever has to wonder if somebody out there believes they're worth the trouble. His eyes found Calvin, then Diane, then Marcus, then finally Ruthie standing at the edge of the crowd with an expression of fierce, unguarded hope that hit him harder than anything else in the room. "This shop isn't mine," Ethan said. "It never really was. It belongs to every person who ever walked through that door needing somewhere to land, and every person who will long after I'm not the one standing here to greet them. $12.30 bought a building. What all of you built inside it, that's worth more than any number Victor Harrington ever offered me, and it always will be." Before the applause could rise, Ruthie's hand shot up from the edge of the crowd, and Ethan paused, caught off guard. "What happens to it?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. "After you, like years from now, when you're not the one running it anymore." The question landed harder than she probably intended, and Ethan considered it seriously before answering, unwilling to give a rehearsed response to something so plainly sincere. "Same thing that happened to me," Ethan said finally. "Somebody who needs it more than they realize walks through that door one day, and it becomes theirs to carry same way. Samuel handed it to me without either of us ever meeting face to face. This place was never about one man's name on a deed. It's about making sure the door stays open long after any of us stop being the ones holding it." He looked at her directly. "Could be you someday if you wanted it." Ruthie's face did something complicated. Surprise, then something fiercer underneath it. And she didn't answer, but she didn't look away either, and Ethan understood the answer would come eventually in its own time. The applause that followed lasted longer than Ethan expected, warm and unguarded. And when it finally settled, Duke stepped forward with something in his hand that made the entire room go quiet again. "Before this gets too sentimental, even for me," Duke said, clearing his throat roughly, "the chapter voted on something last week unanimously, and I want to do this properly in front of everybody who matters." He held out a folded leather vest, and Ethan recognized it instantly. His old cut, the one he'd surrendered 11 years ago. Patches long since stripped away, except now stitched fresh across the back, set a new patch entirely. One Ethan had never seen before, reading simply, "Second chances. We can't undo 11 years." Duke said, his voice rough with an emotion he wasn't bothering to hide. "But the chapter wanted you to know whatever patch you wear or don't wear, brother, you never stop being one of us. Not really, not to the people who actually mattered." Ethan took the vest with hands that weren't entirely steady, running his fingers over the new patch, feeling 11 years of exile settle into something that finally resembled peace. From the back of the room, Gareth stepped forward unprompted, and the crowd parted slightly to let him through. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there a moment in front of Ethan, visibly working up the nerve for something. "I know I don't get a say in this anymore," Gareth said, finally glancing at Duke for permission that Duke gave with a small nod. "But I voted for that patch too. Wanted you to know that specifically. Whatever it's worth coming from the man who took it away from you in the first place." The room had gone very quiet, waiting. "It's worth a lot," Ethan said, and meant it, and something between the two men that had been broken for 11 years finally visibly began to mend in front of everyone who'd gathered to watch. "Thank you," Ethan said again to all of them, this time, and for once the words felt like they were enough. The party lasted well into the evening, and by the time the crowd finally thinned, Ethan found himself standing alone on the sidewalk beside Rosalind, both of them watching the last of the taillights disappear down Miller Street. 5 years, Rosalind said quietly. "That's how long the trust conditions run, before you're free to do whatever you want with what's left. You know that?" "I know. Most men in your position would already be counting down the days," she said, glancing at him sideways, "wondering what they'll finally get to keep for themselves once the obligation's paid off." Ethan looked back at the shop, at the sign glowing softly in the evening light at the photograph wall, visible through the front window. Already 3 names longer than it had been 6 months earlier. "I stopped counting a while ago," he said. "Turns out the thing I get to keep was never really about the money." Rosalind smiled, small and genuine, the first fully unguarded expression Ethan had seen from her since the day he'd walked into her office not knowing what he actually owned. Samuel would have liked that answer, she said. For what it's worth, coming from a woman who knew him better than most, I think he'd have liked everything about how this turned out. Word of the shop spread well beyond the county over the following year, slow and steady, the way honest things tend to spread, each graduate carrying the story with them into whatever came next. Ruthie Alvarez finished her apprenticeship 18 months after that first nervous afternoon and took a job at a dealership in Missoula, sending back a photograph of her very first paycheck with a note that read simply, "Couldn't have done this without you and Calvin." Diane's advanced electrical course grew large enough to need a second instructor, and she brought in a former student of her own to help teach it, extending the same chance Samuel had once extended to her one careful hire at a time. Marcus eventually stepped back from his Bozeman shops, entirely handing them to two employees he trusted completely, and moved to Miller Street full-time, saying only that some circles, once you finally got close enough to closing them, were worth closing all the way. The laid-off factory worker who'd walked in nervous and unsure that first week, a heavy-set man named Roy Kessinger, who'd spent 22 years on an assembly line before the plant shut its doors, finished his certification in under a year, and opened a small independent repair shop 2 towns over, sending Ethan a photograph of his own hand-painted sign with a note that read, "Never thought 54 was too old to start over till you all proved me wrong." The 19-year-old, fresh out of the group home, stayed on as a part-time assistant, even after finishing his coursework, unwilling, he admitted once to Calvin, to leave a place that had felt more like family in 6 months than anywhere else had in 19 years. Gareth showed up every Tuesday like he'd promised, teaching advanced electrical work with the same quiet competence he'd once brought to running a motorcycle club, and slowly, carefully, without either man ever quite naming it out loud, something like friendship began rebuilding itself in the space 11 years of silence had left behind. Callie visited twice more that year, once bringing a group of teenagers from her own youth center on a field trip that left half the kids talking about motorcycle mechanics for weeks afterward, and the second time simply to sit with Ethan on the back steps of the shop for an hour, saying very little comfortable in a silence that had taken over a decade to earn. Victor Harrington's development broke ground on the rest of Miller Street. 8 months later, exactly as he'd said it would, 400 jobs and $11 million in promised revenue, rising slowly around the one small parcel he'd formally released. He never came by the shop again, though Ethan heard secondhand through Rosalind that Harrington had quietly donated a modest sum to the youth apprenticeship program under a name that wasn't his own, an anonymous gesture that Ethan chose, deliberately not to investigate further. Some men, it seemed, spent the rest of their lives making small private amends for arguments they could never fully win. Grant Weller stopped by once unannounced near the end of that same summer, standing awkwardly near the door in a way that bore no resemblance to the smooth, unhurried man who'd once offered Ethan $200,000 with a practiced smile. "I'm not with Harrington's firm anymore," Weller said before Ethan could ask. "Left about 4 months back. Wanted to see the place honestly. See what all the fuss had actually been about." He looked around slowly at the training bay, the crowded schedule board, the photograph wall now stretching nearly the full length of one room. "I've spent 15 years helping men like Harrington take things from people who couldn't afford to fight back. Guess I wanted to see what it looked like when somebody actually won." "What do you think?" Ethan asked, unable to fully shake the old wariness even now. "I think I picked the wrong side of this particular fight," Weller said simply, and left without asking for anything. And Ethan never saw him again, though he thought sometimes that the visit had been its own quiet kind of apology. On a quiet Sunday morning that same autumn, Ethan drove out to the small county cemetery on the edge of town, something he'd meant to do for months and kept putting off, unsure what he'd even say. Samuel's headstone was simple, unadorned, exactly the way Ethan imagined the man himself would have wanted it. No mention of the fortune he'd quietly given away. No mention of the lives he'd rebuilt. One careful name at a time, just a name, 2 dates, and a single line beneath them. He fixed what others gave up on. Ethan stood there a long while, hands in his pockets, feeling foolish and sincere in equal measure. "I don't know if this is how it's supposed to work," he said finally out loud to a headstone that couldn't answer him. "Talking to you like this, but I figured you'd want a report, so here it is." He exhaled slowly. "The shop's standing. Better than standing, it's full most days, more than I know what to do with sometimes. Calvin teaches now. So does Diane, and Marcus moved back permanent, and even Gareth's found his way to Tuesdays." He paused, throat tightening. Harrington backed off. "Turns out he knew you a long time before either of us knew anything about him. Guess even the men who spend their whole lives fighting you were still somewhere underneath it missing you. He crouched down, brushing a few stray leaves from the base of the stone. I met Callie again, he said quietly. She's good, Samuel. Really good. Runs a place just like this one in her own way. I think you'd have liked knowing that. He stood back up, looking out over the quiet rows of headstones toward the mountains beyond them. I still don't fully understand why you picked me, but I'm trying every day to be worth the choosing. That's the only thank you I know how to give you now. He stayed a few minutes longer, then drove back to Miller Street, where a line of students was already waiting outside the door for the afternoon session to begin, Frank among them, leaning against the building with 2 coffees in hand, one of which he held out the moment Ethan climbed out of his truck. Where were you? Frank asked, though something in his expression suggested he had already guessed. Went to see Samuel, Ethan said, taking the coffee gratefully. Frank nodded slowly, no further explanation needed. He'd be proud of you, you know. Whole town's proud of you for that matter, even the ones who laughed at you in that auction house. He clapped Ethan on the shoulder, the same easy gesture he'd offered 100 times over the past year. Come on, got a line of nervous strangers waiting to see if this place is really as good as everybody's been saying. It's better, Ethan said, and meant it completely, and the two of them walked back toward the door together, the afternoon light catching the sign overhead exactly the way it had every day for the past year, and exactly the way it would, Ethan understood now, with unshakable certainty for a great many years still to come. On the 1-year anniversary of the day, Ethan had raised his hand in a silent auction hall and paid $12.30 for a building nobody wanted. He stood in the doorway of Whitmore's Second Chance Garage, watching a new class of students file in for their first day, a laid-off factory worker in his 50s, looking for a second career, a young mother working around her daughter's school schedule, a 19-year-old fresh out of a group home with nowhere else to be, each of them carrying the same nervous, hopeful uncertainty Ethan himself had carried into an auction house he'd had no business walking into. He greeted each of them personally at the door, the way he'd made a habit of doing since the very first class. Roy Kessinger, to the factory worker, said, offering a broad, calloused hand, clearly uncertain whether he belonged among the younger faces filling the room behind him. 22 years on an assembly line, and I don't know the first thing about fixing an engine, if I'm honest. Neither did I 11 months ago, Ethan said, shaking his hand firmly. Turns out that's not really the requirement. The young mother introduced herself as Teresa, apologizing before she'd even finished saying her name for the fact that she might need to step out occasionally for school pickup, and Ethan told her without hesitation that the shop would work around her schedule and not the other way around, because that was exactly the kind of flexibility Samuel's mission had always been built to offer. The 19-year-old, quiet and watchful in a way that reminded Ethan sharply of Calvin's own description of himself at that age, gave only his first name, Marcus, coincidentally, though not the Marcus Ethan already knew, and flinched slightly when Ethan extended a hand, like he wasn't entirely sure the gesture wouldn't be withdrawn. You're in the right place, Ethan told him, holding the handshake a beat longer than necessary, the way Samuel himself had probably done for dozens of frightened young men over 4 decades. Nobody in this building is going to ask you to explain where you came from, just where you're trying to go. Something in the boy's shoulders loosened just slightly, and he followed the others inside without another word. Calvin caught Ethan's eye across the room and gave him a small, knowing nod, the exact same gesture Samuel must have once given him on a cold evening years earlier, propping open a door for a man with nowhere else to go. Ethan thought standing there about every version of himself that had led to this exact moment, the 20-year-old biker who'd stopped for a stranger on a rainy highway without a second thought, the disgraced man who had spent 11 years fixing motorcycles alone in a rented garage, the fool who'd raised his hand for a building the whole town had already written off. Every one of those men had made a choice that cost him something, and every one of those choices had led him probably, impossibly, to this room full of strangers about to become something more. He thought about Samuel Whitmore, dead 6 years before Ethan ever knew his name, who had spent an entire lifetime proving that the debts worth carrying were the ones that never stopped paying forward. He thought about Victor Harrington, an old man still quietly making amends for a friendship he'd nearly destroyed, chasing something that was never going to fill the space kindness was supposed to occupy. He thought about Gareth rebuilding trust one careful Tuesday at a time, and Callie turning 20 stolen minutes into an entire life's purpose, and Duke, who'd finally found the courage to say 11 years too late, what should have been said immediately. None of it had been easy. None of it had been fast. But standing in that doorway watching a room full of people nobody else had believed in, stepped forward to build something new out of whatever they'd survived. Ethan understood with a certainty that settled all the way into his bones exactly what a $12 shop had actually been worth all along. It had never been about the building. It had always, from the very first envelope with his name written on it in a dead man's careful hand, been about proving that nobody, not a fallen biker, not a struggling mechanic, not a scared teenager with nowhere else to go, was ever truly beyond a second chance, as long as somebody was willing to stand in the doorway and hold it open. Ethan Walker raised his hand one more time that morning, not to bid on anything this time, but simply to wave the newest class of students inside, and as they filed past him into the shop that a dead man's faith and a stranger's stubborn kindness had built together, he understood finally and completely that some debts were never meant to be paid off. They were meant to be passed forward one open door at a time for as long as there was still somebody left who needed one. And on Miller Street, in the shop that $12.30 had bought and an entire town had helped rebuild, there always would be.